I never believed in monsters until I took the job at Flatwoods State Forest in West Virginia. My name is Tristan, and I was fresh out of college with a degree in forestry management and a head full of romantic notions about protecting pristine wilderness. The park supervisor, an old man named Walter with a weathered face and tired eyes, hired me without much fanfare. "You'll work the eastern quadrant," he said during my first day. "Trails, maintenance, wildlife management, pretty straightforward." What he didn't mention, what I'd later learn he deliberately omitted, was that the eastern quadrant hadn't seen a full-time ranger in 3 years. The last 2 had quit within weeks. My first month was uneventful. I hiked the trails daily, marked dangerous branches, cleared brush from the paths, and filed detailed reports about animal sightings: deer, bears, the occasional bobcat, nothing unusual. The forest was beautiful in that late autumn way, all amber and crimson leaves against granite cliffs. I'd sit on the ridge overlooking the valley in the evenings, watching the sun paint the sky purple and orange, and I'd think I'd made the right choice leaving the city. Then came the noises. It started on a Wednesday night in November. I was in the ranger station, a small prefab building about a mile from my cabin, updating the wildlife log when I heard it. A sound like nothing I'd ever encountered. Not quite a howl, not quite a shriek. It had a quality that made my skin crawl, something almost human in its distress, but fundamentally wrong. It echoed through the trees for nearly a minute before cutting off abruptly. I went outside with a flashlight. The forest was still and silent, the way it gets right before snow. I called into the darkness, asking if someone needed help. No response. I waited for 20 minutes, but the sound didn't return. Walter dismissed it when I reported it the next morning. "Coyote pack," he said, not looking up from his coffee. "You'll hear all sorts of things out there. Your mind plays tricks on you in the woods. You learn to ignore it." But I couldn't ignore it. The sounds came more frequently. 3 times that week, always around midnight, always from the deeper forest to the east where the old logging roads had become overgrown. Sometimes they sounded almost like laughter, other times like something wounded and dying. I hiked out each time to investigate and found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no evidence of anything. By the 3rd week of November, I'd stopped bothering to check. I'd started keeping a knife by my bed in the cabin instead. I'd also started drinking more than was probably healthy, trying to sleep through the sounds. It was the morning of November 22nd when I found the first piece of evidence that something was genuinely wrong. I was hiking the Ridgeline Trail, clearing fallen branches from the previous night's windstorm, when I noticed something glinting between the rocks about 20 feet off the path. At first I thought it was just a discarded beer can. The local teenagers sometimes hiked into the forest to drink, but as I approached, I saw it was a piece of clothing. It was a sweatshirt, dark gray, completely shredded. The cuts weren't the work of rocks or branches. They were deliberate, vicious tears that suggested something with claws or teeth had worked it over. There was dark staining on the fabric. I didn't touch it immediately, instead circling it carefully, looking for tracks. What I found made my mouth go dry. The imprints in the soft earth around the sweatshirt were massive, not bare. I'd studied bear prints extensively during my training, and these were nothing like bear tracks. These were shaped almost like human feet, but enormous. The stride length suggested a creature that was at least 7 feet tall, and there were claw marks, 5 of them, arranged in a pattern that suggested a hand, not a paw. I photographed everything with my phone and called Walter immediately. "I'm at coordinates 37.9847 minus 82.4156, I told him. "There's evidence of a possible animal attack, clothing, signs of struggle." Walter was quiet for a long moment. "Tristan, listen to me carefully. Don't touch anything. Don't investigate further. Pack a bag and come back to the station. We need to talk." His voice had changed. The dismissive edge was gone, replaced by something like fear. When I arrived at the station an hour later, Walter was waiting for me with a concerned expression I hadn't seen before. He poured 2 cups of black coffee without asking if I wanted any and sat across from me at the old wooden desk. "How much do you know about the folklore of this region?" he asked. I told him I knew the basics. Native American legends, local ghost stories, the usual rural folklore. "There's something else," he said. "Something that doesn't make it into the official tourism brochures. Something that happened in 1952, not far from where you found that sweatshirt." "What are you talking about?" Walter took a long drink of coffee. "There's a reason we have trouble keeping rangers in the eastern quadrant. It's not official, and it's certainly not in any report you'll find. But if you're going to stay here, you need to know what you might be dealing with. He told me the story then. In September of 1952, a family living on the outskirts of Flatwoods reported seeing something emerging from a bright object in the sky. The creature they described was 7 or 8 feet tall, metallic, skeletal, with a sharp-pointed head and glowing eyes. The official explanation was mass hysteria, a misidentification of a barn owl or a balloon. But that wasn't the whole story, Walter explained. In the days and weeks following the sighting, hikers began disappearing from the forest. Not all at once. That would have drawn attention. One here, one there. Over the course of 3 months, 7 people vanished without a trace. The searches turned up nothing. It stopped, Walter said. Just stopped after that 3rd month. But the thing that terrified the authorities at the time was what they eventually found. Not bodies. We never found bodies, but pieces. Fragments of clothing, personal effects, scattered across a 5-mile radius. All of them torn and shredded in ways that didn't match any known animal behavior. I felt cold despite the warm coffee in my hands. The official investigation was quietly closed, Walter continued. The disappearances were attributed to hiking accidents, runaway teens, that sort of thing. But the locals knew. We knew something was out there, something that didn't belong in any classification of animal we understood. You're telling me there's a monster in this forest? I said, hearing how stupid I sounded. I'm telling you to be careful, Walter replied. Lock your cabin at night. Don't hike alone after dark. Report anything unusual immediately. And if you ever encounter anything that seems off, anything that doesn't feel right, you run. You don't investigate. You don't try to get a better look. You run to populated areas, and you don't stop until you reach civilization. I left the station that afternoon with more questions than answers. Over the following days, I threw myself into research. I visited the library in the nearest town and found old newspaper clippings from 1952. The official reports mentioned the sighting but played it off as a hoax. The disappearances were scattered across different reports, framed as unrelated incidents. But the pattern was there if you looked for it. By the end of November, I'd convinced myself that Walter was wrong, that it was folklore, local legend, the kind of story communities tell to explain the unexplainable. The torn sweatshirt could have been from anything. The tracks could have been distorted by my mind, seeing what I expected to see. I was wrong. December arrived cold and clear. The snow came on the 5th, a heavy snowfall that transformed the forest into something that looked pristine and untouched. I welcomed it, hoping that the tracks I might find would finally give me answers. On December 8th, I went out early to check the trail conditions after the snow. The forest was silent, the kind of quiet that seems to absorb sound. My breath came out in white clouds as I hiked the eastern ridge, my boots crunching on the snow. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. The creature stood about 40 yards away, silhouetted against the white snow, perfectly still. It was roughly humanoid, but the proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its legs too thin, and its head was oddly shaped, pointed at the top, with a metallic sheen that caught the winter sunlight. The Flatwoods monster. It turned to look at me, and I saw the glowing eyes that the 1952 accounts had described. Not glowing with any natural luminescence, but with something that seemed to come from inside its skull, a phosphorescent green that burned in the morning light. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed by a combination of terror and fascination. This creature, this impossible thing, was real. Everything Walter had said was true. The monster took a step toward me that broke my paralysis. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the snow, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't look back. I just ran, crashing through the forest, branches whipping at my face, drawing blood. I didn't stop running until I saw the ranger station through the trees. Walter believed me immediately, which was somehow more terrifying than if he'd dismissed me as hysterical. Did it try to communicate? He asked, urgency in every word. It just looked at me, I gasped, still breathing hard from my panicked run. Those eyes, they weren't natural, Walter. They were wrong. And then I ran. He nodded slowly. That was smart. If it had wanted to hurt you, it would have. The fact that it just watched means it was studying you, learning about you. That doesn't make me feel better. Walter pulled out a file from a locked drawer in his desk. It was thick, filled with old documents, photographs, and newspaper clippings. I've been collecting information for 15 years, he said, ever since I took this position. The official records won't help us, but the anecdotal evidence is clear. The Flatwoods monster operates on a pattern. He laid out a map of the forest marked with small red dots. These are the last known locations of people who went missing in the eastern quadrant, going back as far as the 1950s when records become available. You'll notice they're not random. They follow the ridgeline, the old logging roads, specific corridors through the forest. I studied the map. He was right. The dots formed an almost deliberate pattern, like the creature had territory, preferred routes, a structure to its hunting. In 1952, there were 7 disappearances in 3 months, Walter continued. Then nothing for 8 years. In 1960, 2 more people vanished. Nothing for 10 years after that. In 1971, there was a cluster, 5 people in 6 months. Then quiet again until 1985, when we lost 3 hikers. And most recently, 1998, a woman disappeared from the visitor center parking lot. Why hasn't anyone connected these? I asked. Why isn't there an investigation? Because the gaps are too long, Walter replied. By the time enough evidence accumulates to suggest a pattern, the official record keepers have moved on, and the creature becomes folklore, local legend, something that can't be proven because proof would require admitting that something exists that we can't explain or control. I pulled up a chair and sat heavily. What does it want? I have theories, Walter said. The 1952 accounts mention seeing something in the sky before the creature appeared. The initial witnesses were terrified, but they all reported the same thing, a craft of some kind, not from here. You're saying it's an alien? I'm saying I don't have a better explanation. The creature exhibits intelligence, tactical awareness, an ability to evade pursuit. It doesn't hunt like a natural predator. It seems to be collecting specimens. I felt my stomach turn. Collecting. The bodies were never found because there were no bodies to find, Walter said quietly. At least, not whole ones. The fragments we discovered were scattered across a wide area, disposed of deliberately. Whatever this thing is, it takes its victims somewhere, studies them perhaps, and then disperses the evidence. We spent the rest of the day and into the evening going through Walter's files. I read testimonies from hikers who'd reported seeing something unusual, interviewed families of the disappeared, studied the few blurry photographs that purported to show the creature. One image, taken in 1960 by a park visitor, showed a tall skeletal figure between the trees. The photograph was grainy and out of focus, but there was no doubt in my mind that it was the same creature I'd seen that morning. You need to leave, Walter said as the sun was setting. Pack your things and go. I can't protect you if you stay. You're leaving too, I said. It wasn't a question. I can't, Walter replied. I've made a commitment to this forest, to keeping records, to trying to understand what's out there. But you have a life to live. Get away from here, Tristan. Forget about the Flatwoods. Forget about the monster. But I couldn't leave. Not now. Not when I finally had answers to the strange sounds that had plagued me for weeks. Not when I understood that the forest itself harbored a secret that the world had chosen to ignore. Let me help you, I told Walter. Let me understand this thing. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. If you're going to stay, you need to be smarter about it. You need to observe without being observed. The creature knows your scent now, your appearance. It will be looking for you. Over the next week, Walter taught me everything he'd learned. How to move through the forest quietly, how to read signs of the creature's presence, how to set up observation points in the deep woods without leaving traces that might draw attention. The creature, Walter explained, seemed to have a pattern of activity. It moved through the forest in cycles, ranging through different sections over weeks and months. Right now, based on the location of my encounter and the distribution of recent disturbances, it was in the western section of its territory. We have time, Walter said, but not much. In my observations, once the creature focuses on a particular area, and more importantly, once a human has seen it directly, it becomes more aggressive, more active. It's as if making contact accelerates something in its behavior. On December 15th, I set up an observation post on a high ridge overlooking one of the creature's known corridors. I built it carefully, using the terrain to conceal myself, creating a shelter from branches and canvas that blended into the forest. I equipped it with a camera, binoculars, and a detailed logbook. And I waited. The nights were brutally cold. I'd come to the post in the evening and stay until dawn watching the forest. Most of the time, there was nothing to see. Just the wind and the bare branches, the occasional nocturnal animal moving through the underbrush. But on the third night, I saw it. It moved through the forest with an unsettling grace, traveling on what looked like two legs but with a gait that was distinctly inhuman. Its head turned slowly from side to side as if it were sampling the air or listening to sounds I couldn't hear. I remained absolutely motionless, barely breathing. My hand slowly moved to the camera, and I took several photographs as the creature passed below my vantage point. It was larger than I'd remembered from my first encounter, easily 8 feet tall, with an elongated body that seemed to shift and change as the darkness and moonlight played across its form. It wore no clothing, but its skin or hide had a strange texture, almost chitinous, with a faint metallic sheen. Its hands were wrong, too many joints in the fingers, too long, too flexible, and those eyes, even from a distance, I could see them glowing with that sickly green luminescence. The creature paused directly below my post and seemed to sniff the air. My entire body went rigid. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to flee, but I knew that movement meant death. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, the creature remained still, its head tilted. Then it moved on, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. I didn't breathe freely until nearly an hour had passed. When I returned to the ranger station at dawn, Walter took one look at me and knew. "You saw it," he said. I nodded and showed him the photographs. As he examined them, his expression grew more troubled. "This isn't normal," he said quietly. "The creature doesn't typically come this close to human activity during the day. And it doesn't return to the same area twice in such a short span unless..." "Unless what?" "Unless it's hunting someone specific," Walter finished. I became the hunted very quickly after that night. The evidence was subtle at first. Branches broken on the trail I always took to the observation post. My footprints circled and examined carefully, as if something had studied my gait and movement pattern. A tree near my cabin with deep gouges in the bark, positioned at a height of about 9 feet. Scratches that suggested claws, or something worse. Walter installed locks on my cabin that would have been suitable for a bank vault. He also insisted I carry a handgun at all times, though he was careful to remind me that conventional weapons would likely prove ineffective against the creature. "If it decides to come for you," he said, "the gun won't save you, but it might give you time to run. Aim for the eyes if you get the chance. The glow suggests sensitivity there. But mostly, just run." The nights became a study in terror. I'd lie in my bed, every nerve on edge, listening to every sound. The creature had learned my schedule. It came to my cabin almost every night, circling it, testing the locks, probing the windows. On December 20th, it tried to break in. I was jolted from a fitful sleep by the sound of something large and heavy crashing against the cabin's door. The entire structure shook. I grabbed the gun from my nightstand and pointed it at the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely aim. There was another impact, even more violent than the first. The door frame cracked. "Walter?" I screamed into my radio. "I'm coming," his voice crackled back. "Hold on, Tristan." Another crash. The door buckled inward. I fired 3 shots through the door without aiming. The impacts were deafening in the small space. For a moment there was silence. Then I heard something that chilled me to my very core. Laughter. Not human laughter, but a series of clicking, hissing sounds that suggested amusement. The creature was toying with me. Walter's truck came roaring up the cabin a few minutes later, headlights blazing. I heard the creature's shriek, that horrible, anguished sound that had plagued my early weeks in the forest. Then the heavy footfalls as it fled into the darkness. I burst out of the cabin, my gun still in my hand, and nearly shot Walter when he emerged from the truck. He looked as terrified as I felt. "Pack everything," he ordered. "We're going to town. We'll stay at a motel, figure out our next move." But even as we drove towards civilization, I knew it wouldn't matter. The creature had my scent. It had my location. It had become obsessed with me. In town, staying in a cheap motel room, Walter made phone calls. I could hear fragments of the conversations. Something about authorities, about making a report that would stick this time, about documentation and evidence. "They won't help us," Walter said after hanging up from his final call. I spoke to a state environmental officer I've worked with before. He made it clear that without a body, without irrefutable proof, they can't do anything. And even if they could, he suggested that creatures matching that description exist in folklore all across North America, and that most reports are misidentifications or outright fabrications. "So we're on our own," I said. "We're on our own," Walter agreed. That's when Walter proposed his plan. It was insane, but I was desperate enough to listen. "The creature is intelligent," he said, more intelligent than any animal we know. That means it thinks, it plans, it has motivations beyond simple hunger. What if we could communicate with it? What if we could negotiate? Negotiate with a creature that's been hunting me? I laughed, a sound bordering on hysteria. It hasn't killed you, Walter pointed out. It's had multiple opportunities. If it wanted you dead, you'd be dead. So maybe it wants something else. Maybe it wants to study you, understand you, or maybe it wants something you have. I spent the next 2 days helping Walter formulate his plan. We would return to the forest, but we would do it with purpose. We would set up camp in a clearing, open ground where the creature couldn't approach without being seen, and then we would try to establish some form of communication. With what? I asked. It doesn't speak English. It might respond to other forms of communication, Walter suggested. Light patterns, sound frequencies, visual displays. The 1952 sightings mentioned the craft making unusual sounds. The creature might respond to certain frequencies. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only plan we had. We returned to the forest on December 22nd, equipped with sound generation equipment, powerful flashlights, and recording devices. We set up camp in a large clearing about 2 miles from my cabin, in an area that offered no cover and clear sight lines in all directions. It will come, Walter assured me. It's been too focused on you to ignore an opportunity like this. We waited through the afternoon, setting up equipment, testing the systems. As evening fell, I felt the presence before I saw it. The creature emerged from the tree line slowly, deliberately, as if it understood the symbolic nature of the moment. It stood perhaps 50 yards away, its elongated head turning to examine us, those glowing eyes fixed on me, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not fear exactly, but something stranger. A sensation of being seen, truly and completely seen by an intelligence utterly foreign to everything I understood. Walter moved slowly, deliberately, and activated the sound generator. It emitted a low-frequency pulse that I felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to resonate with something deep in my bones. The creature's reaction was immediate. It took a step forward, its head tilting in what might have been curiosity or recognition. Then it made a sound, not the shrieking cry I'd heard before, but a series of complex clicks and whistles that had an almost musical quality. It's responding, Walter whispered. Oh my God, it's responding. For the next hour, we exchanged sounds with the creature. Walter would input sequences into the equipment, and the creature would answer with its own vocalizations. It was like listening to a conversation in a language I didn't understand, but the tone seemed to shift from aggressive to something calmer, almost contemplative. Then the creature took another step forward. Stay calm, Walter instructed, but I could hear the tension in his voice. The creature advanced another 10 feet, then stopped. Its elongated fingers flexed, and I noticed that the metallic sheen on its hide seemed to pulse with the same green luminescence as its eyes. I think, Walter began, but he never finished. The creature moved with terrifying speed. It covered the remaining distance in what seemed like a single bound, and suddenly it was upon us. Walter had time to shout a warning, but nothing more. I ran. I didn't look back to see what the creature was doing to Walter. I didn't try to help him or fight back. I simply ran, crashing through the darkness with nothing but the light of my flashlight and pure animal panic driving me forward. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. I ran until I burst from the forest onto a road, flagging down a passing truck with desperate waves of my arms. The driver, a man in his 60s, took one look at me, covered in blood and dirt, eyes wild, and immediately drove me to the nearest hospital emergency room. The police investigation that followed was perfunctory at best. Walter's death was attributed to a bear attack, despite the fact that his injuries bore no resemblance to typical bear mauling patterns. The authorities seemed almost relieved to have an explanation that fit their preconceived notions, that didn't require them to accept that something inexplicable had happened in the Flatwoods. I told them nothing about the creature. What would have been the point? I was already being treated as an unbalanced individual traumatized by grief and forest isolation. Adding a story about an alien creature would only have ensured my commitment to a psychiatric facility. I left West Virginia and tried to return to normal life. For a while it worked. I got a job with a Forest Service in California, put distance between myself and the Flatwoods, and attempted to convince myself that it had all been some kind of shared delusion with Walter. But I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes. That moment when the creature had looked directly at me, and I'd felt the weight of its attention. an intelligence that was vast and patient and utterly indifferent to human morality or understanding. And then 6 months into my new life in California, I found something. I was hiking in a forest preserve near my home when I came across something that stopped my heart. On a tree, at a height of about 9 feet, were scratches, not from a bear or a mountain lion. They matched exactly the gouges I'd seen on the tree near my cabin in Flatwoods. The creature had followed me across the country. That's when I realized the terrible truth. Walter had been right about one crucial thing. The creature wasn't trying to kill me. It was studying me, learning from me. And somehow, I had become the focus of its attention in a way that transcended geography. I've moved 3 times since then. Each time I've found evidence that it knows where I am. Scratches on trees, broken branches arranged in patterns I recognize, the occasional glimpse of that tall skeletal form disappearing into the darkness. I've tried to study it the way Walter did. I've compiled information, researched folklore from around the world, looked for any account of similar creatures that might give me insight into its nature or purpose. The most disturbing pattern I've found is this. Every 15 to 20 years, there seems to be a cluster of disappearances in various parts of North America. Different locations, different decades, but the same pattern. People vanishing without explanation, leaving behind only fragments and questions. What if the creature Walter and I encountered wasn't unique? What if there were many of them, each with their own territories, their own collections? What if what happened in Flatwoods wasn't an isolated incident, but part of something vast and systematic? I've spent the last 2 years documenting everything, keeping records like Walter did, trying to understand the pattern. And I've come to a chilling conclusion. The creature isn't hunting me because I'm special or threatening. It's studying me because I survived contact, because I tried to communicate, because I've become in some small way an observer of its existence. And now I think it wants to study me more closely. Last week, I saw it in the parking lot near my apartment. Not fully visible, but unmistakably present. A tall silhouette between cars, that distinctive head shape outlined against the streetlight. I've started packing. Not because I think running will help, I've learned that lesson, but because I need to stay ahead of it, to keep moving, to maintain the distance. Walter is dead because he tried to understand the creature. I'm alive because I ran, but I don't think that will save me forever. Eventually it will catch up. Eventually those glowing eyes will fix on me with purpose rather than curiosity, and when that moment comes, I'll understand at last what it wants from me. What it's been studying all this time. I only hope that when it finally takes me somewhere in whatever remains of my consciousness, I'll find the answers that Walter died seeking. The forest remembers us, even when we leave it, and something in the darkness between the trees is remembering me. My name is Cody, and I've spent the last 12 years as a park ranger in the remote wilderness of northern Minnesota. I know these forests better than I know my own reflection. Every trail, every creek bend, every ancient stand of white pine that's been here longer than any of us. I thought I knew what danger looked like out here. Wolves, bears, the occasional hiker who ignored warnings and got themselves lost. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I found on the morning of September 14th. I was on my routine patrol, moving through the Boundary Waters area just before dawn. The September air had that bite to it, the kind that reminds you winter's coming whether you're ready or not. My breath came in white clouds as I hiked along the old forestry trail, my boots crunching on the frost-covered pine needles. The world was silent except for the distant cry of a loon echoing across some unseen lake. That's when I saw the first tracks. At first I thought it was a bear. The prints were massive, sunk deep into the soft earth beside the trail, but as I knelt down to examine them more closely, something felt wrong. The shape was almost human, 5 digits, a defined heel, but the stride was wrong. The distance between prints was at least 8 feet. No human, no bear I'd ever encountered could move like that. I'd been a ranger long enough to trust my instincts, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, but I didn't. I followed the tracks. They led me deeper into the forest, away from the established trails, into areas I rarely ventured. The prints were fresh, maybe 6, 8 hours old at most. Occasionally, I'd see claw marks raked deep into the bark of trees, strips of white wood exposed where something had torn through the dark wood. The marks were high up, at least 9-10 feet up on the trunk. Whatever made them had tremendous reach. After about 3 miles of following the trail, I came upon a clearing. In the center of that clearing was the remains of a moose. I've seen predator kills before. Wolves bringing down a moose is nature's brutal mathematics. Survival and death existing in the same moment. But this was different. This was something else entirely. The moose was split open, torn apart with a ferocity that seemed almost personal. Its ribs were spread wide as if something had wrenched them open with bare hands. The internal organs were mostly gone, consumed or scattered across the clearing in a grotesque display. What remained of the head was turned at an impossible angle, the neck snapped clean. But the worst part was the tracks around the carcass. They were everywhere, circling the kill again and again, as if whatever made them had danced around their meal in some kind of ritualistic frenzy. The prints went in and out, overlapping themselves, showing a pattern of movement that wasn't random hunting behavior. It was deliberate, methodical, almost hungry in a way that went beyond simple predation. I took photographs with my ranger-issued camera, documented the scene as protocol demanded. My hands were shaking as I worked. In all my years out here, I'd never seen anything like it. The ranger station would want documentation. The state would need reports. As I was finishing up, I noticed something else. Carved into the bark of a massive pine tree at the clearing's edge were marks. Not claw marks this time. These were deeper, more deliberate. They looked almost like symbols, straight lines that intersected at sharp angles, patterns that seemed to form shapes I couldn't quite make sense of. I photographed those too, then headed back toward the ranger station. I didn't know then that I should have run. That evening I submitted my report. The senior ranger Tom reviewed my photographs and made some calls. Wildlife management said they'd send someone out to investigate, probably in a few days. They weren't particularly alarmed. Large predator kills weren't uncommon, even unusual ones. The consensus was probably a bear, maybe a pack of wolves acting unusually. Nothing to worry about. But I was worried. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those tracks, the impossible stride, the symbols carved into that tree. At around 2 a.m. I gave up trying to rest and instead pulled out my personal laptop and started researching. Most of what I found online was useless, cryptid websites and folklore forums full of people with too much time on their hands. But as I dug deeper, reading through accounts from other rangers, Native American histories of the region, and old frontier journals digitized by the State Historical Society, a pattern began to emerge. The Wendigo. I'd heard the name before, of course. It's part of Minnesota folklore, part of the larger mythology of the northern forests. But I'd always dismissed it as legend, the kind of thing people talked about around campfires to scare newcomers. The stories were consistent, though, pulled from different sources, different eras, different people. A creature of hunger, of the deep winter, something that lived in the forests of the north and was drawn to death and bloodshed. The descriptions varied, but certain elements repeated themselves. The creature was impossibly tall, sometimes described as skeletal, sometimes as muscular and twisted. It moved on 2 legs like a man, but moved in ways no man could. It left tracks like human footprints, but too large, too widely spaced. And the violence. Every account mentioned the violence, the frenzied consumption, the ritualistic nature of the kills. One account, from a trading post journal dated 1887, described a winter when something moved through the forests near what is now the Boundary Waters. The hunter who wrote the account never used the word Wendigo, but the description fit. He wrote about finding animals torn to pieces in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than hunger. He wrote about hearing sounds in the night, not quite animal, not quite human. And most chillingly, he wrote about the feeling of being watched, constantly, methodically watched. He ended his entry by writing, "It studies us the way we study prey. God help us if it decides we are worth hunting." I closed my laptop at dawn, having gotten no sleep, my mind churning with possibilities I didn't want to entertain. The next day I requested to take some personal leave. My supervisor asked if everything was okay, and I told him I needed to clear my head. He approved it without much pushback. Ranger work is isolating, and burnout is common. He didn't know that I was planning to spend my time preparing. I spent 3 days gathering supplies, additional ammunition for my rifle, high-powered flashlights, rope, flares, an emergency radio, extra food and water. I didn't know what I was preparing for exactly, or what good any of it would do against something that seemed designed by nature itself to be a perfect predator. But I needed to feel like I was doing something. On the evening of the 3rd day, I was sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the darkening forest. The sun had gone down about an hour ago, and the sky was that deep purple blue that comes just after dusk. The first stars were beginning to appear. It was peaceful. It was beautiful. That's when I saw the shape move through the trees at the edge of my yard. For just a moment, silhouetted against the darkening sky, I saw something move across the tree line. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it moved on two legs with a peculiar jerking gait. The shape was there and then gone, disappearing back into the forest before I could fully process what I was seeing. I jumped to my feet, my coffee mug falling and shattering on the porch. I grabbed my rifle from inside and stepped out into the yard, my eyes searching the tree line. Nothing. Just the dark forest, the same forest I'd loved and worked in for 12 years, now transformed into something alien and threatening. I stood there for nearly an hour, rifle ready, searching the darkness. Whatever I'd seen didn't reappear. Eventually the cold drove me back inside, but I didn't sleep that night either. I kept every light in my cabin on and sat in my chair with my rifle across my lap, watching the windows. Around 3 a.m. I heard it, a sound at the edge of my property, something moving through the brush. Not the sound of a deer or a moose. I knew those sounds well enough. This was something else. Something heavy and deliberate. Something that moved with terrible purpose. The sound circled around my cabin slowly, deliberately, like something testing the perimeter. It took everything I had not to run outside and start firing into the darkness. The sound eventually faded, moving away into the forest. But the feeling didn't fade. That sensation of being watched, of being studied by something with intelligence behind those unseen eyes, it stayed with me through the rest of the night and into the pale gray dawn. I knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic and reason, that whatever was out there had come to know where I lived, and it would be back. I made the decision to leave my cabin the next morning. Staying there, isolated, waiting for something to come for me seemed like suicide. I needed to get to where there were other people, where I could think clearly and figure out what was happening. I packed my truck with essentials and drove into the nearest town, a small place called Tower, about 45 minutes from my cabin. I checked into a motel and spent the next 2 days watching the news, reading more about the Wendigo, and trying to decide if I was losing my mind. The rational part of my brain kept trying to convince me of simpler explanations. Maybe what I'd seen wasn't a Wendigo at all. Maybe it was just an unusually large bear standing on its hind legs in the dimming light, a trick of perception in the dusk. Maybe the kill site was just a normal predator following normal predator behavior. Maybe the tracks were from different animals, and my mind had connected them into a pattern that didn't actually exist. But then on the third day, I received a call from Tom. There had been another kill. This time it wasn't a moose. It was a hiker, a young woman named Sarah Chen who had been hiking in the Boundary Waters alone. Against all recommendations, a search and rescue team had found what was left of her about 5 miles from where I'd discovered the moose carcass. The description Tom gave me made my blood go cold. The same signs of frenzied violence, the same ritualistic pattern of the kill, and in the area around the body they'd found more of those strange symbols carved into nearby trees. The state police were being called in. The Forest Service was talking about closing sections of the Boundary Waters, and they wanted to interview me, since I'd been the one to report the initial kill. I met with the state police and Forest Service officials at the ranger station. They asked me questions about my findings, showed me photographs of the hiker's remains, photographs I desperately wish I'd never seen. They theorized about what could have done it. A bear, they said, maybe a pack of wolves, possibly a mountain lion that had wandered north from its normal range. But I saw doubt in their eyes. I saw the same unease I felt reflected back at me. As the official investigations continued, I did my own investigating. I spent days hiking through the forest, looking for more signs of the creature. I found more kills, a deer, a beaver, a black bear that had apparently gotten unlucky. Each kill site had those symbols carved nearby, as if marking territory or making some kind of claim. I also began to notice a pattern in the sightings. The creature seemed to be moving generally northward, following the river valleys and mountain ridges. Its kills were becoming more frequent, moving from days between them to nearly every night. It was like something was awakening or being called to a particular place. One evening, I was examining another kill site near Basswood Lake when I heard the sound of movement in the brush nearby. My hand went immediately to my rifle, and I spun around, ready to fire. But what stepped out of the trees wasn't what I expected. It was another human, a man in his 60s, wearing old-style camping gear that looked like it hadn't been washed in days. His hair was wild and matted. His eyes had the intensity of someone who'd been living rough for a very long time. "Don't shoot," he said, raising his hands. "I'm not here to hurt you." My rifle was still raised. "Who are you? What are you doing out here?" "My name is Marcus," he said. "I've been tracking it for 3 years, ever since it killed my daughter." I lowered the rifle slightly. "The creature? The Wendigo?" He nodded, a grim expression crossing his weathered face. "You know what it is then. Most people don't believe, not until it's too late. Not until something they love is gone." Over the next hour, Marcus told me his story. His daughter had been a research assistant studying wildlife patterns in the northern forests. 3 years ago, she'd gone out on a routine field expedition and hadn't come back. Search and rescue had found only scattered remains and the same strange symbols I'd been finding. Marcus had spent the last 3 years tracking the creature, obsessed with understanding it, learning its patterns. He'd collected the historical accounts I'd found online and dozens more that weren't published anywhere. He'd interviewed indigenous peoples whose ancestors had stories about the Wendigo going back centuries. He'd become an expert on something most people refused to believe in. "It's not just an animal," Marcus told me as we sat by a small fire that evening. "It's something older, something that's been here longer than we have. There are theories, old theories, that suggest it might be more than one, that they might be a species breeding in the deepest parts of the forest, hidden from human observation. But I think this one is singular. I think the one that killed my daughter is the same one that's been killing people and animals for at least the last century, maybe longer." "Why hasn't anyone stopped it?" I asked. Marcus laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "With what? Guns? Most people won't believe what they're seeing even when it's standing in front of them. And it's smart, intelligent, it learns. After my daughter died, it disappeared for almost 2 years. When it came back, it was more careful, more strategic. It doesn't kill in the same places anymore. It keeps moving." "It was at my cabin," I told him. 3 nights ago. It came to where I live." Marcus leaned forward, his expression intensifying. "It's hunting you specifically. That means something. That means you've attracted its attention in a way most people don't." We talked through the night, and Marcus shared everything he'd learned. He showed me documents, photographs, hand-drawn maps tracking the creature's movements through the years. He'd developed a theory about its behavior, that it was driven by an almost compulsive need to consume, to kill, but that it had patterns we could study, patterns we might be able to use. "If we can predict where it's going," Marcus said, "we can set a trap. We can end this." I wanted to believe him. But as I listened to his voice shake with obsession, as I saw the years of suffering written across his face, I understood that this was a hunt that had consumed him entirely, and I was beginning to understand that it might consume me the same way. Marcus and I spent the next week preparing. Using his maps and his accumulated knowledge, we identified a location he believed the creature would pass through. A narrow valley between 2 ridges where multiple kill sites suggested it regularly hunted. We set up camp about a mile away, hidden in thick forest, and waited. We barely spoke during that week. Marcus seemed lost in thought most of the time, staring into nothing with eyes that had seen too much. I kept myself busy maintaining our equipment, checking the ammunition, making sure our escape routes were clear. Neither of us was willing to admit the obvious. We were planning to hunt something that might be actively hunting us. On the 7th night, we saw it. I was on watch when I heard the sound of movement in the valley below us. I nudged Marcus awake. He'd been sleeping fitfully against a tree, and we both grabbed our rifles and moved toward the sound. What we saw will stay with me for the rest of my life. The creature emerged from the tree line into a patch of moonlight, and for the first time I saw it fully, clearly, without the distortion of dimming light or fear clouding my perception. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Its frame was skeletal in some places, powerfully muscled in others, as if it was a thing built of contradictions. Its skin was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, stretched tight over bones that seemed wrong, too many joints, angles that suggested movement in directions a normal body couldn't achieve. But worst of all was its head. It had a face after a fashion, but it was nothing like a human face. The mouth was too wide, splitting its skull open to reveal teeth that weren't teeth so much as pointed spikes of bone. Its eyes were hollow sockets that somehow still contained awareness, still conveyed an awful, conscious intelligence. And as I watched, paralyzed by the sight of it, that face turned toward our position. It knew we were there. "Fire!" Marcus screamed, and he opened up with his rifle, the sound so loud in the quiet night that it seemed to split the world open. The creature moved. God, the way it moved. It was impossibly fast, all jerking, disjointed motions that seemed to phase between normal movement and something that violated the laws of physics. Bullets hit it. I saw them strike, saw impacts that should have torn through bone and flesh, and it didn't even seem to notice. It charged up the hillside toward us with a sound that can only be described as a howl combined with something that sounded almost like laughter. I fired. Again and again. Rounds that struck home. I saw blood, dark and wrong-smelling, with a copper acidity that made my eyes water even from a distance. But it kept coming. Marcus was backing away, still firing, his face a mask of determination and something else, something that looked like relief, like he'd finally gotten what he'd been waiting for. "Run!" I shouted, and we turned and broke through the forest, crashing through underbrush toward our camp and the truck beyond it. Behind us I could hear the creature moving, not directly chasing us but paralleling our route, as if herding us somewhere. And I realized with terrible clarity that it had been herding us all along. From the moment it saw us at my cabin, from the moment we'd started tracking it, we were the ones being hunted. We made it to the truck. Marcus fumbled with the keys, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip them, and finally got the engine started. We threw our equipment in the truck bed and he hit the accelerator, the truck bouncing over the rough forest road toward the main highway. For a few moments I thought we might actually make it. I thought we might escape. Then the creature landed on the roof of the truck. The impact was enormous. The whole vehicle lurched under the weight. The roof crumpled inward and I could see the skeleton-thin face with those hollow eyes appear through the crushed metal, looking down at us with what I can only describe as curiosity. Marcus screamed and yanked the wheel hard to the right. The truck went off the road, plowing through trees. The creature was thrown off, crashing through the forest behind us. Marcus floored the accelerator, and we burst out onto a proper road just as the forest opened up. Behind us, the forest remained dark and still. Marcus drove for a solid hour before we finally pulled into a rest stop. We were shaking, both of us soaked in sweat and fear. We sat in the truck, doors locked, every light on, watching the darkness around us. "We heard it," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "I saw the blood. We heard it." "Will it die?" I asked. Marcus didn't answer. He just stared ahead into the darkness, his eyes empty. We drove to the nearest town and checked into a hospital. I told them we'd been attacked by a bear. The staff treated our wounds. We both had deep lacerations from the underbrush, and I had a broken rib from being thrown against the truck door. They kept us overnight for observation. The next morning, Marcus was gone. He'd left during the night, taking his research and his obsession with him. The nurse who'd checked on him thought he'd just decided to leave. I knew better. I think a part of him wanted to go back out there. I think a part of him had always wanted to. I never saw him again. That was 3 months ago. I've left the Ranger Service. I've moved to a city, Minneapolis, as far from those forests as I could get while staying in Minnesota. I have a normal job now, in a normal office, surrounded by normal people. But I think about those forests every day. I think about those hollow eyes and that too wide mouth and that skeletal face. And I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the boundary waters, leaving symbols carved into trees, hunting in the night. More than that, I wonder if it's hunting me, if I've been marked somehow by that encounter, if there's a connection between us now that can't be broken by distance or time. Sometimes, late at night, I hear sounds outside my apartment window, things moving in ways that don't quite fit with normal urban wildlife. And I lie in bed, my heart pounding, wondering if it's finally found me again. I wonder if it will ever stop hunting. I wonder if anything ever could. I've spent 17 years working as a park ranger in Minnesota, and I've learned that the wilderness respects no man. It doesn't care about your experience, your training, or your confidence. The forest has its own rules, and those of us who work within it learn quickly to follow them or perish. My name is Malachi, and this is the account of what happened during the winter of 2019, an account that no one will believe, but one I feel compelled to document nonetheless. Perhaps someday, when enough evidence accumulates, when enough people come forward with similar experiences, the truth will finally be acknowledged. Until then, I offer this testimony. I'd requested the remote posting that year. The isolation appealed to me. My marriage had dissolved 2 years prior, and I'd been drifting through the routine of ranger work without purpose or passion. When I learned that the Superior National Forest was seeking someone to manage a remote station during the brutal winter months, I volunteered immediately. The position would keep me away from civilization for 4 months straight, patrolling vast stretches of frozen wilderness with minimal contact with other rangers. The station sat at the edge of the forest, roughly 30 miles from the nearest town of any significance. It was a modest structure, a cabin really, though officially designated as a ranger station. It had electricity powered by a generator, a wood-burning stove for supplemental heat, and radio communication with the main office. The supplies were delivered before the heavy snow came, stacked carefully in the storage shed out back. I was told that if I needed anything urgent, I should radio, but they made clear that urgent needed to mean life-threatening. The budget didn't accommodate frequent resupply runs in winter. I arrived in late November, when the forest was transforming from autumn's golden death into winter's frozen grip. The trees stood like skeletons against gray skies, and the temperature was already dropping below freezing at night. By the time December arrived, I would be completely isolated. The access road would become impassable. The radio, my only connection to the outside world. Those first few weeks were peaceful, almost meditative. I maintained the trails, checked the equipment, and settled into a rhythm. The silence of the winter forest was profound. The only sounds were wind through bare branches, the creak of ice forming on the lake, and occasionally the calls of ravens. I found myself sleeping better than I had in years, but there were moments, small things that in hindsight were warnings I failed to heed. The first incident occurred in early December, about a week into my posting. I was out on a routine patrol, maybe 5 miles from the station, when I noticed something odd. A deer carcass, relatively fresh, hung from a low branch of a towering pine. It wasn't the fact of the kill that disturbed me. Predators are part of the ecosystem. It was the way it had been positioned. The carcass was arranged with an almost deliberate care, suspended at roughly eye level, with nothing obviously holding it in place. When I examined it more closely, I found that branches had been twisted and bent to create a crude harness of living wood. I examined it for tracks, but the frozen ground revealed little. Whatever had made the kill was long gone, but the arrangement haunted me. In 17 years of forest work, I'd never seen an animal position its kill like that. It suggested either a human presence in the area, unlikely in winter, or something with a level of deliberation that prey animals simply didn't possess. I photographed the carcass and its surroundings, made notes in my patrol log, and continued on. I told myself it was probably teenagers from the nearest town, some kind of hunting ritual or prank, but I didn't quite believe that explanation. The second incident came 3 days later. I was chopping firewood behind the station when I heard it. A sound like no animal I could identify. It was high-pitched, almost like a human scream, but wrong somehow. The cadence was off, the tone containing frequencies that seemed to vibrate in my chest rather than my ears. The sound came from somewhere in the forest, maybe a quarter-mile distant, and it lasted perhaps 5 seconds before cutting off abruptly. I stood motionless, axe in hand, listening. Nothing followed. The forest returned to its winter silence. That night, I consulted my reference guides. The nearest large predators would be wolves, bears, or mountain lions. I'd heard wolf howls before, haunting sounds, but distinctly canine. This had been different, more human than animal, yet more monstrous than human. I told myself it was a mountain lion in distress. They do make unusual vocalizations. But even as I thought it, I knew I was lying to myself. By the middle of December, the snow had come in earnest. The road to the station was now impassable, and the isolation I'd sought had become absolute. The radio crackled occasionally with check-ins from the main office, but they were brief and professional. They asked only if I was well and if I needed anything. I always answered that I was fine, but I wasn't fine. Something was changing in the forest around me. The animals had begun to act strangely. The birds that had been relatively present through November had largely vanished. The occasional glimpses of deer or the distant sight of a moose had ceased entirely. It was as if the wildlife knew something I didn't, and they were fleeing. And then there were the signs. I found them on one of my patrols. Massive scratches on the bark of several trees, gouged so deeply that the wood beneath was exposed, pale and fresh. The marks were at least 8 feet high, beginning at the level I could reach on my tiptoes, and extending upward far beyond the reach of any normal animal. They were spaced roughly 3 feet apart, suggesting the spread of something with long fingers or claws. I photographed everything and continued my patrol with a growing sense of unease. When I returned to the station, I made a detailed radio report to the main office. I described the scratches, the location, my observations about the missing wildlife. The ranger who took my report, a man named Tom, whom I'd spoken with several times, went quiet for a moment. "You're sure about the height?" he asked. "Positive," I replied. 8 feet, maybe more. Another pause. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the radio. "Malachi, we'll send someone out to investigate once the weather clears. For now, make sure you're locking up the station at night. Probably just a bear that's more aggressive than usual. Sometimes happens if they've had a hard year finding food." But bears would be hibernating, and we both knew it. He was offering me a polite fiction, a rational explanation I could cling to. I appreciated it, even as I rejected it. That night, I locked the doors, something I'd never bothered with before, and kept the fire burning hot in the stove. I sat in the main room of the station, listening to the wind howl through the trees, and wondered what I'd gotten myself into by volunteering for this isolation. What I didn't know then was that the worst was still to come. What I didn't understand was that something ancient and hungry had noticed me, and that my presence in its territory had awakened an interest that would quickly turn to obsession. The forest had been waiting for me. The Wendigo had been waiting. December wore on, and the winter deepened. The temperatures dropped to dangerous levels, 40, 50, sometimes 60 below zero with the wind chill. The station's heating system worked overtime, and I found myself feeding wood to the stove almost constantly. The isolation that had seemed peaceful in November now felt claustrophobic. But I wasn't alone. I became increasingly certain of this fact. The evidence accumulated slowly. Footprints appeared in the snow around the station, vast and three-toed, nothing like any track I could identify. They were bipedal. Whatever made them walked on 2 legs, but the stride was all wrong. The tracks measured nearly 18 inches long and seemed to be made by something that weighed at least 600 pounds. They circled the station, pressed up against the windows, and paced back and forth like something studying the building and its occupant. I photographed the tracks obsessively, documenting them from multiple angles, marking their locations on maps. The main office seemed increasingly concerned by my reports. Tom, my contact, began asking me more detailed questions about my state of mind. Was I sleeping well? Had I noticed any unusual physical symptoms? Was I sure I was reading the tracks correctly? I understood what he was implying without saying it outright. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Maybe I was seeing patterns that weren't there, finding meaning in natural phenomena because the loneliness was making me paranoid. But then the animal came. I was inside the station when I heard it. A sound of something massive crashing through the frozen brush at the forest's edge. I grabbed my rifle and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon was full, casting everything in shades of blue and silver, and the snow was bright enough to see considerable detail. At the forest's edge, perhaps 50 yards from the station, something stood. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was vaguely humanoid but grotesquely distorted. The body was impossibly thin, emaciated to the point of appearing skeletal, yet it stood perhaps 7.5 feet tall. The limbs were elongated and bent at odd angles, jointed in ways that seemed to have more articulation than they should. The head was the worst part, a skull-like visage with sunken features and a mouth that seemed too wide, the jaw hanging open in a position that suggested a scream or perhaps a laugh. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They reflected the moonlight, yes, but they also seemed to glow with their own sickly luminescence. And they were fixed on the station, fixed on me. I stood frozen, unable to move, barely able to breathe. The thing at the forest's edge tilted its head as if studying me in return. The movement was jerky and unnatural, more like a bird than a mammal, executed by a creature that didn't fully understand the mechanics of a neck. Then, with no wind-up or preparation, it shrieked. The sound was apocalyptic. It was the cry of something in agony and hunger and rage all at once. It was the noise of a creature so twisted that its very existence was a form of suffering. The sound seemed to vibrate through the walls of the station, setting the windows rattling, causing items on the shelves to dance and rattle. I stumbled backward, raising the rifle, but the creature was already turning away. With a gait that was more like a lope, it bounded back into the forest, covering impossible distances with each stride. Within seconds, it had vanished into the darkness between the trees. I immediately radioed the main office. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate the radio, and my voice was high and tight when I transmitted. "This is Malachi at the Northern Station. I need to report a wildlife incident. I've observed an unidentified animal of significant size and apparent aggression in proximity to the station." The response was almost immediate. "Malachi, are you injured?" "No, but are you in immediate physical danger?" "Not currently. The animal has retreated into the forest, but stand by, we're checking weather conditions. We may be able to send a team out tomorrow if conditions permit." But conditions did not permit. A massive storm rolled in overnight, and for the next 3 days visibility was nearly zero and travel was impossible. The station became a fortress of isolation, and I was trapped within it. And the thing in the forest knew it. That first night after the encounter, I didn't sleep. I sat in the main room with the rifle across my lap, the fire burning hot, every lamp in the station switched on. I kept watch at the windows, scanning the surrounding forest for any movement. Around 2 a.m. it came back. This time it didn't hide. It walked directly up to the front window and pressed its face against the glass. I got a clear look at it in the lamplight spilling from the interior. The creature's head was enormous, the skull elongated and prominent. The skin appeared blackened and desiccated, stretched tight over bone. The teeth were visible in that horrible grin, teeth that seemed far too numerous and far too long. And those eyes, those luminous, malevolent eyes, stared directly into mine. I fired. The rifle report was deafening inside the enclosed space of the station. The window shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the creature shrieked, that same apocalyptic wail, before vanishing into the storm. I immediately boarded up the window with plywood from the emergency supplies, my hands trembling so severely I could barely drive the nails. Then I radioed the main office again, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've discharged my firearm. I fired on an unknown animal that approached the station. I believe I may have struck it, but I cannot confirm. The weather is preventing pursuit or investigation." There was a long silence on the other end of the radio. "Malachi, I'm going to be direct with you. Are you in a stable state of mind? Do you feel safe?" The question hung in the air between us. The honest answer was no. I was terrified. I was possibly losing my grip on reality. I might have just fired at nothing but a trick of the light and the isolation, a manifestation of my own paranoia and fear. "I'm stable," I said, "but I want you to understand, something is out there, something that isn't normal, and I don't think a firearm will stop it." Another pause, then Tom's voice, careful and measured. "We're going to get you out of there as soon as this storm passes. Just hold on, you're safe inside the station. Nothing's going to breach those walls." But he was wrong about that, and I was beginning to understand why. Over the next 2 days while the storm raged, the creature, or creatures, I was no longer certain there was just one, tested the integrity of the station with methodical persistence. They threw themselves against the doors. They clawed at the boarded windows. They scraped and shrieked and howled, creating a symphony of horror that was almost worse than silence. The sounds they made ranged from that apocalyptic wail to lower, almost guttural moans that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. And underneath it all, I heard something else, a sound like chewing, the crunch of bone, and the wet sound of tearing flesh. They were eating something just outside my walls, perhaps within feet of where I huddled. I tried not to think about what they might be eating. By the time the storm cleared on the 3rd day, I had exhausted myself to the point of near Catalonia. I sat in the chair by the cold fireplace. I'd let it die, fearing that the light might draw attention, and stared at nothing. My hands were raw from gripping the rifle. My voice was gone from disuse. When the radio crackled to life, I could barely muster the strength to respond. "Malachi, this is Tom. The weather's clearing, we're dispatching a response team. They should be with you in about 4 hours. Can you confirm you're still safe and functional?" I told him I was fine. I don't know if he believed me. The response team arrived in a snowmobile caravan, 3 rangers including Tom himself. They found the station in good order, from the outside at least. The boarded windows, the bullet hole through the front glass, and the claw marks scattered across the building exterior told their own story. But it was what they found in the snow around the station that changed everything. Animal remains. Scattered across a 100-yard radius were the bones of various creatures, deer, moose, even what appeared to be a bear, far larger than any I'd seen in the area. They had been torn apart with an almost casual brutality, the bones cracked open to access the marrow, the remains arranged in no particular pattern but with what seemed like deliberate scattering, and surrounding it all, circling the killing field, were tracks, massive three-toed prints that matched those I'd documented in my photographs. But there were more now, perhaps a dozen different sets of tracks, of varying sizes, indicating multiple creatures. Tom's face went very pale as he surveyed the scene. "Pack a bag," he said. "We're getting you out of here. Now." I didn't argue. The headquarters of the Superior National Forest is located in town, about 40 miles from where I'd spent the last month. The drive took us 3 hours, and during that time, Tom and I spoke very little. He seemed to be wrestling with something, trying to reconcile what he'd seen with what he believed to be possible. Once we arrived at the office, he brought me into a conference room and left me there with coffee and a sandwich I couldn't eat. I sat alone for a long time before Tom returned with another ranger, a woman named Sarah, who introduced herself as the area supervisor. "Tom tells me you had an encounter with an unidentified animal," she said, settling into a chair across from me. I described everything: the scratches on the trees, the footprints, the appearance of the creature or creatures, the sounds, the attack on the station, all of it. Sarah listened without interrupting. When I finished, she exchanged a look with Tom that I couldn't quite interpret. "Malachi, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room," she said. "It's not something we publicize, and it's certainly not something we acknowledge officially. But you've seen something, and you deserve to know what it might be." She stood and walked to a filing cabinet, retrieving a thick folder. Inside were documents, old ones, some dating back decades, photographs, witness statements, incident reports. "The Superior National Forest is part of a region with a long history of unusual sightings," she continued. "Most of them are explainable: misidentifications of bears, moose, or other known animals, poaching activity, unauthorized hunting, but some of them fit a pattern." She spread out photographs across the table. They showed enormous, skeletal, bipedal creatures, many of them indistinct or blurry, the kind of photographs that conspiracy theorists traffic in, but also physical evidence: claw marks on trees matching those I'd seen, paw prints measuring 18 inches or more, scattered bone piles that were arranged in deliberate patterns. "We have reports going back to the 1800s, Sarah said. "Sightings in northern Minnesota, occasionally spreading into Wisconsin, Michigan, even Ontario. The descriptions are remarkably consistent: emaciated humanoid figures, extraordinary height, bipedal locomotion, nocturnal activity patterns, and an apparent obsession with hunting and consuming large animals." "What is it?" I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. "We don't know for certain," Sarah said. "The theories range from undocumented primate species to something far older. But the local people, the Ojibwe and other tribes who lived in this region long before European settlement, they have a name for it." She pulled out one more document, an old book on American folklore. "They called it the Wendigo," she said quietly, "a creature from their mythology, a cannibal spirit, created from human greed and transformed into something monstrous. The Wendigo was said to be eternally hungry, driven by an insatiable appetite for flesh. According to the mythology, it was twisted and gaunt, sometimes standing more than 10 feet tall, and it was drawn to the scent of blood or the presence of death." I stared at the photographs, at the accounts, at the centuries of documentation of encounters with this thing. "You're telling me that's real," I said. "That thing is real, and it's out there in the forest, and you're not doing anything about it." Sarah exchanged another look with Tom. "What would you have us do?" she asked. "Go public with reports of a cannibal creature stalking the northern wilderness? The panic that would cause would be enormous, and we have no way to actually eliminate the threat. Hunting expeditions have been attempted in the past. None have succeeded. The creature, or creatures, there may be more than one, are far too intelligent and too dangerous." "So what, you just accept that it's there? You let it hunt?" "We manage it," Sarah said carefully. "We monitor sightings. We try to keep people out of areas where recent activity has been documented. And in the rare cases where someone encounters it, we offer them the option to be quietly transferred or relocated. Most take us up on that offer. The story usually gets buried. Official explanations of equipment failure or animal attack or simple disappearance." I felt sick. "How many people?" "It's hard to say with certainty. Over the past 50 years, probably a dozen or more. Some were rangers like you. Some were hunters or hikers who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some were transients whose disappearances went largely unnoticed." The full weight of what she was telling me crashed down. This wasn't a secret anomaly. It was an accepted, managed tragedy. The organization knew there was a dangerous predator in the forest and had decided that the cost of living with it was preferable to the cost of trying to stop it. "I'm being transferred," I said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "Your choice of location. We have ranger positions opening up all over the country. You pick and we make it happen. Full severance if you want to leave the service entirely. And you sign a non-disclosure agreement." "What if I don't?" "Then you're free to tell anyone and everyone you want," Sarah said. "But consider, who will believe you? You have no concrete proof, no photographs clear enough to be definitive. You fired one shot and claimed to hit something that disappeared. Any decent skeptic will pick apart your account. You'll be labeled as mentally unstable, suffering from isolation psychosis. It will destroy your reputation and your career." She was right. I knew she was right. "Besides," she continued, almost gently, "keeping quiet keeps you safe. That creature, if it is a creature, if this isn't all some elaborate hoax we've been maintaining for decades, it has a territory, it has patterns. If you're not in its territory, it can't get to you. But if you make yourself a public figure saying you were attacked by a monster, you might draw its attention in a whole new way." I left that meeting with a list of transfer opportunities and a document to sign. I chose a remote position in Alaska, someplace far enough away that I could pretend the entire thing had been a dream. But before I left Minnesota, I did something I wasn't supposed to do. I broke into the filing room and photographed every document related to Wendigo sightings that I could find. I wanted evidence. I wanted proof that this wasn't something I'd imagined. What I found confirmed my worst fears. The sightings went back centuries. The earliest documented accounts were from French fur traders in the 1700s who reported encounters with skeletal, man-shaped creatures that seemed impossible by any rational standard. There were sketches, detailed descriptions, and accounts of entire hunting parties being decimated by what the witnesses described as a single entity of obvious intelligence and malevolent purpose. By the 1800s, the accounts were more sporadic. Perhaps the creature had learned to avoid populated areas. Perhaps it had been temporarily killed and was regenerating. One folklore account suggested the Wendigo was nearly immortal, capable of being wounded but never permanently destroyed. In the 20th century, sightings increased again. A hunter in 1953 reported seeing a 10-foot creature dragging a moose into the forest. A backpacking couple in 1972 reported hearing unearthly sounds and finding enormous footprints surrounding their campsite. A park ranger in 1998, Tom himself, I realized with shock, had filed a report of observing the creature at a distance and noting its humanoid but profoundly alien characteristics. But there were also the missing persons reports, names and dates, photos of hikers, hunters, and rangers who'd vanished in the northern forest. Some were eventually found, sometimes as scattered remains. Others were never found at all. The official explanations ranged from accidental death to voluntary disappearance to foul play by unknown perpetrators. But the photograph I came to know most intimately was not of the creature itself, but of a memorial in a small cemetery in Michigan. 12 names were engraved on a stone monument erected in 1962 in memory of those lost to the wilderness. 12 people, ranging in age from 17 to 63, all of whom had vanished in the Superior National Forest over the course of 50 years. And that memorial predated my arrival at the station by more than 50 years. How many names had been added to it since? How many families had been told official lies about hiking accidents and early onset dementia and wrong place, wrong time tragedies? I moved to Alaska and tried to put it all behind me. I told myself that the creature, if it was real, was someone else's problem now. I was safe. I had escaped. What the Wendigo, I learned, was not a problem that could simply be escaped. It was a problem that understood the concept of unfinished business. 3 months into my transfer, I received a letter. It was handwritten, the penmanship precise and deliberate, but the words themselves were written in a hand that shook with either rage or madness. "You left," the letter said. "You ran. But you saw us, you know we exist, and that knowledge is a debt you can never repay. The hunger will find you again. It always does. We are always hungry, and those who catch our scent never truly escape." The letter was postmarked from Minnesota. There was no return address. I showed it to my supervisor, a woman named Jennifer who knew nothing of my real history. She suggested I contact law enforcement, that this might be harassment from someone with a grudge or a paranoid belief system. I took that advice and filed a report, but I didn't tell them the real story. I couldn't. The police investigated and found nothing. There were no fingerprints on the letter, no unusual findings. They advised me to monitor my surroundings and report any further contact, but I knew who the letter was from. It was from Tom, or someone like him, someone embedded in the system, someone who had chosen to protect the creature and maintain its existence as a dark secret, someone who had decided that my silence was negotiable and my safety was conditional. That night I did something I'd been avoiding. I researched the Wendigo mythology more thoroughly, not through official channels or the dry bureaucratic documents I'd seen at Ranger headquarters, but through genuine folklore and mythology sources. What I found was disturbing. The Wendigo, according to Ojibwe legend, was not a natural creature. It was created from human greed and cannibalism. A person who consumed another human being out of hunger, whether literal hunger or hunger for power, wealth, or dominance, could be transformed into a Wendigo. The transformation was said to be inevitable and irreversible. The creature lived in a state of perpetual hunger. No amount of feeding could satisfy it. It was driven by an insatiable need for flesh, a need that grew worse the more it fed. Over time, it became weaker in body but stronger in intelligence and malice, a paradox that the legends suggested was somehow tied to its nature as a being created from human sin. And most disturbing of all, the Wendigo could not act directly on humans through physical means alone. It worked through suggestion, through creating hunger and desperation in others. It drove people to take actions they would never have considered in normal circumstances. It spread its curse by making others like itself. The letter took on new meaning in light of this. T wasn't necessarily Tom. It could be anyone connected to the creature, anyone who had become part of its system. And the message wasn't a direct threat, it was a psychological one. The creature was working on my mind, trying to make me afraid, trying to create conditions that would drive me back to the forest, or make me do something desperate. But why? What purpose would that serve? Unless I was exactly where it wanted me to be. I thought about the transfer, how easily it had been arranged, how Sarah and Tom had seemed almost relieved when I agreed to leave, how the non-disclosure agreement I'd signed had actually made me complicit in the silence that allowed the creature to continue hunting. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't escaped. I'd been released. And in being released, I'd become a vector for the creature's influence. By keeping quiet, by signing documents, by walking away, I'd become part of the system that protected it. That month, 3 hikers vanished in the Superior National Forest. The news reports were brief, speculating about bear activity or early season complications. I knew better. I knew what had taken them. I spent sleepless nights considering my options. I could go public with everything, the photographs, the documents I'd taken, the complete account of what I'd experienced. But Sarah had been correct. Who would believe me? The physical evidence was ambiguous. My testimony would be dismissed as the fantasy of an unstable man, and in making the attempt, I would almost certainly sign my own death warrant. Alternatively, I could continue my silence, accept the transfer, build a life in Alaska, and try to forget. But the letter had made clear that forgetting wasn't an option. The creature would find me, in one form or another, as long as I knew of its existence. There was a third option, one that had been growing in my mind like a parasite. I could go back. I could return to the Superior National Forest, not as an isolated ranger, but as someone actively seeking the creature. I could attempt to document it conclusively, to gather proof that would be undeniable. And if I succeeded, if I actually managed to capture evidence concrete enough that the government couldn't suppress it, then maybe the cycle could be broken. Maybe others would stop disappearing. It would be suicide, of course. The creature was intelligent and powerful, and it would be prepared for my return. It had already marked me once. A second encounter would likely be my last, but at least I would be doing something. I would be acting with agency rather than being acted upon. I would be taking responsibility rather than hiding behind non-disclosure agreements and official denials. In April, I submitted my transfer request back to Minnesota. The response came within 3 days. Transfer approved, contingent on a psychological evaluation. The evaluation was cursory. A contracted therapist asked me if I was experiencing suicidal ideation or major depression, if I was hearing voices or experiencing paranoid thoughts. I answered carefully, presenting myself as stable and capable. I'd thought about these questions long enough to provide answers that would pass scrutiny. By May, I was back at a ranger station in northern Minnesota, not the same one. That particular station had been closed officially due to budget concerns, but similar, 100 miles north of my original posting, in an area with even fewer visible human settlements, and the creature I knew would be watching. I spent the summer preparing. I installed motion sensor cameras in the forest, high-definition units that could capture images and video in extreme conditions. I set them up in areas where I'd found evidence of the creature's presence. I gathered everything I could about its patterns and behavior. In July, I caught something on camera. The footage was clear. A bipedal creature, nearly 8 feet tall, moving through the forest at night. It was skeletal and desiccated, its skin stretched tight over visible bone. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, limbs bending in directions that shouldn't have been possible, and it moved directly toward one of my cameras, as if aware of the device's presence. At the moment of contact, the camera's screen went dark. I recovered the memory card and found that the footage had been corrupted. The last visible image showed those luminous eyes, impossibly close to the camera lens. Someone had tampered with the device. The creature, or someone acting on its behalf, had deliberately destroyed the evidence. I tried again with new cameras in different locations. The result was the same. The footage would capture the creature, and then the equipment would be destroyed or corrupted. It was almost playful, in a way. The creature or its agent was demonstrating that it understood exactly what I was trying to do and was preventing me from succeeding. By September, as the temperature began to cool and the forest started its transformation toward winter, I understood the full scope of my situation. The creature could not kill me directly while I was at the ranger station. This was something I'd begun to suspect, and the past months had confirmed it. But it didn't need to kill me directly. It had other tools at its disposal. The isolation was affecting my mind. I was sleeping poorly, eating sporadically, and spending long hours obsessing over the evidence I couldn't quite capture. I was becoming exactly what the ranger headquarters would have wanted me to become, a man isolated from human connection, driven by obsession, slowly losing his grip on objective reality. And that was the real trap. The creature didn't need to kill me because the system I'd been part of, the system designed to keep the Wendigo's existence secret, was already working on my destruction. By forcing me back to Minnesota, by making my existence there an implicit part of their cover-up, they had ensured that I would either go mad or go public. Either way, my credibility would be destroyed. In October, I made my decision. I walked away from the ranger station. I left everything behind and drove south, not stopping until I reached a library with internet access. I created anonymous accounts on every platform I could think of and began uploading what I had: the photographs, the copies of the ranger headquarters documents, the accounts of my experiences, the coordinates of the memorial cemetery. The posts went nowhere. No one shared them. No one believed them. They were lost in the ocean of internet noise, indistinguishable from every other conspiracy theory and crackpot narrative that clutters the web. But I kept uploading, I kept posting, I created websites and filled them with documentation. I sent emails to newspapers and television stations and cryptid research organizations. Most ignored me, but a few responded with skepticism or derision. One person did reach out, though. A professor at a university who specialized in American folklore and had read my accounts with genuine interest. She asked me questions, listened to my story without immediately dismissing me, and suggested that what I was describing might actually be a phenomenon worth studying more systematically. Her name was Dr. Sarah Chen. She was exactly what I needed: someone credible, someone with academic standing, someone who could potentially bring the weight of institutional research to bear on the Wendigo question. We met in person in November. I showed her copies of the documents and photographs. She listened to my account with growing concern, and then she told me something that shattered my fragile hope. "This exists," she said, pointing to a map on her laptop. "A predatory species we don't fully understand, something that lives in the margins of human civilization and has learned to hide its presence through generations of natural selection. It's real, Malachi, but it's also protected." Protected? I stared at her. By whom? By people like me, she said quietly. Academics, biologists, researchers who understand that this creature serves an ecological function. It culls populations. It maintains balance in ways we don't fully comprehend. The Ojibwe people understood this. They didn't try to eliminate the Wendigo. They tried to live with it, to exist in a state of cautious coexistence. "It kills people," I said. "Yes, but people also kill animals needlessly, destroy forests, eliminate entire species. The Wendigo's predation exists within natural limits. If we expose it, if we try to hunt it, the result will be ecological catastrophe for an entire region. Can you live with that? Can you trade the lives of a few lost hikers and hunters for the potential extinction of a species and the collapse of an entire ecosystem?" I didn't have an answer. The problem she described was real, but so was the problem of people vanishing, of families destroyed by official lies, of the creature growing bolder as it learned that humanity wouldn't challenge it. There's another option, Sarah said. She pulled out a book, a collection of Ojibwe folklore and teachings, the traditional approach to living with the Wendigo. There are protocols, practices that minimize predation while allowing the species to survive. They involve things like creating designated hunting grounds, understanding the creature's territorial needs, and establishing a balance between human activity and the Wendigo's ecosystem. You're talking about making a deal with it, I said. I'm talking about understanding that this isn't a problem with a solution, it's a problem with a management strategy. And the best management strategy is one that respects both human life and the creature's right to exist. I left that meeting without a clear sense of what to do. I understood her point, but I also understood the cost. That cost was silence. It was the sacrifice of the disappeared, the abandoned families, the people who would continue to vanish so that a species could continue to exist. For the past year, I've been living in quiet exile, neither fully committing to exposure nor accepting the new paradigm Sarah had presented. I work a legitimate job, keep my head down, and try not to think about the forest in Minnesota, but the messages continue to arrive. Postcards with postmarks from different cities, always bearing cryptic messages. The hunger remembers. You can run, but you cannot hide from what you've seen. Join us, or be consumed by the knowledge alone. They come from different people, I think. Members of a network of individuals who are either enthralled to the creature or genuinely committed to its protection. Or perhaps there is no network. Perhaps the creature itself is writing the messages, operating through the postal system in ways that would defy rational explanation. I don't know anymore where the boundary between the creature's direct actions and the human system's protection of it actually lies. I don't know if the Wendigo is genuinely intelligent and malevolent, or if it's simply a dangerous animal that humans have constructed elaborate mythology around. What I do know is this: something real exists in the Superior National Forest. It is dangerous. And it will never be stopped because the systems designed to protect us have decided that protecting the creature is preferable to protecting the people it hunts. If you're reading this account, understand that you are reading a document that exists in violation of multiple non-disclosure agreements. Understand that this information could lead to your own targeting by forces both natural and human. But understand also that the creature is real. It's out there. And if you ever find yourself in the northern forests of Minnesota, alone, in the dark, and you hear a sound like a human scream twisted into something monstrous, run, because the Wendigo is always hungry, and it will never stop hunting. I never believed in monsters, not the way people do when they're children, afraid of shadows under beds or shapes moving in dark forests. As a park ranger, I understood the natural world. I knew the difference between fact and folklore, between genuine danger and the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the unexplainable. Wildlife behaves according to biological imperatives. Predators hunt, prey flees. The system perpetuates itself in a rhythm as old as nature itself. Everything has a reason. Everything fits into a neat, organized framework. I thought I was equipped for anything the wilderness could throw at me. I was wrong. Profoundly, irreversibly wrong. My name is Scarlett. I've worked as a park ranger for 12 years across some of America's most remote and dangerous territories. I've seen things that would make ordinary people question their sanity, things that exist in that gray space between known science and legend. What I'm about to tell you is the truth, documented and real, though I understand completely if you don't believe it. I didn't believe it either, not until it was too late to pretend otherwise. This is the story of two encounters, two creatures that shouldn't exist, two places that marked me forever. If you're reading this, you need to know, the wilderness is older and stranger than we dare admit, and sometimes the things we dismiss as myth are simply nature's way of reminding us how small we really are. The heat hit me like a physical force when I stepped out of the truck. August in South Texas is unforgiving. The kind of heat that makes the asphalt shimmer and saps your will to move faster than necessary. I'd been transferred to manage a section of the Big Bend region after the previous ranger retired, and my first week was turning into an exercise in understanding just how vast and empty this territory really was. My station was a small ranger station near a rural community called Terlingua, about 30 miles from the Rio Grande. The landscape was all scrub brush, limestone formations, and endless sky. Beautiful, in its way, but deeply isolating. Cell service was spotty at best. The nearest backup was 2 hours away by vehicle. I was doing my evening perimeter check on my 4th day when I found the first dead animal. It was a javelina, a wild pig native to the region. At first glance, it looked like it had been hit by a vehicle, but the more I examined it, the less sense that made. The animal was positioned in the middle of a narrow hiking trail, nowhere near any road, and the wounds, they weren't consistent with trauma from impact. The puncture marks were too precise, arranged in a pattern that suggested something with multiple points of contact. Something that had fed. I'd seen predator kills before. Mountain lions left certain signatures. Coyotes hunted in packs and tore into their prey with characteristic violence. This was different. The wounds were deliberate, surgical almost, and the blood loss suggested something had drained the animal significantly before it died. I photographed everything and filed a report with the district office in Big Bend. The response was professional but dismissive. Likely a mountain lion or multiple coyotes, they said. File it and move on. Wildlife management wasn't a perfect science. But then the livestock started disappearing. By the second week, I'd received 4 separate calls from ranchers in the area reporting missing animals. Goats mostly, but also 1 young steer. The descriptions were consistent. Animals found dead with strange puncture wounds, drained of blood, left in places that didn't make tactical sense for a predator. One rancher, a weathered man named Morris who'd owned land near the park boundary for 40 years, was adamant about what he'd seen. His daughter had witnessed something in the pre-dawn darkness near their fence line, a shape moving through their livestock pen. She described it as dark, low-slung, with an elongated head and prominent teeth. Chupacabra, Morris said flatly when I visited his property to document the losses. He was standing on his porch, arms crossed, looking out at the scrubland beyond his fence. My grandfather told stories about them, said they came up from Mexico during certain times of year. Everyone thinks it's just myth, but my grandfather knew these lands, and he didn't lie. I didn't argue with him. That would have been disrespectful, and I'd learned early in my career that old-timers often knew things that didn't appear in official wildlife records. Still, I had no framework for what he was describing. Chupacabra sightings were scattered across Puerto Rico and parts of Mexico, mostly unconfirmed accounts with no concrete evidence. The idea that one would be in Texas, in the specific area I was managing, seemed implausible, but the evidence was mounting. I set up wildlife cameras at several locations around the park boundary and near the ranches that had reported losses. Trail cams are standard equipment for monitoring animal populations, and I'd positioned them along game paths and watering holes. I checked them every 2 days. For the first week, I captured nothing unusual: deer, coyotes, a few bobcats, the normal parade of nocturnal wildlife. Then, on the 9th day of surveillance, I found something that made my blood run cold. The camera position near Morris's eastern fence line had captured footage of something moving through the frame at 3:47 a.m. The video was only 4 seconds long. The creature's approach was fast, movement jerky and predatory. What I saw in that clip wasn't anything I could identify. It was roughly the size of a large dog, perhaps 100 pounds, but the body configuration was all wrong. The head was elongated and bulbous, with what looked like a pronounced snout or perhaps an elongated jaw structure. The spine was curved in a way that suggested an unusual skeletal arrangement. But most striking were the eyes. They caught the infrared of the camera and reflected back a phosphorescent green that made my stomach clench with primitive ancestral fear. I watched that 4-second clip 17 times that night, sitting alone in my ranger station, telling myself there had to be an explanation. An animal with a genetic deformity, a diseased coyote or wild dog, a misidentification caused by the video quality or the angle of the shot. But the logical explanations all felt hollow. The kills stopped after that night. I checked my cameras religiously, but there was nothing. No more mysterious predations, no more animals drained of blood. The ranchers called to thank me, assuming I'd somehow resolved the problem through my official presence. I didn't correct them. I kept the trail cam footage private, locked on my personal laptop with copies on a flash drive I carried always. I wasn't ready to explain it to anyone, and I knew what the response would be: hallucination, camera malfunction, misidentification, the same dismissal I'd received about the javelina. But I had seen something. The evidence was digital and undeniable. 3 weeks into my transfer, I made a decision that still troubles me. I requested a temporary reassignment. The paperwork cited transfer opportunities and career development, nothing that would raise concerns. My supervisor was surprised but accommodating. Transfer requests from new rangers weren't uncommon. Within a month, I was reassigned to a different region in northern Texas, away from Big Bend and the mystery of what was hunting in that remote country. I told myself it was the right call. I had no way to protect the ranches, no way to explain what I'd seen, and the losses had stopped. Moving on made professional sense, but I was also running. And deep down, I knew that whatever I'd encountered in Big Bend was still out there, still hunting, still feeding on the livestock and wildlife of that harsh landscape. I would learn, much later, that I hadn't been the first ranger to encounter it, and I wouldn't be the last. My transfer took me north to manage a section of the National Forest System in eastern Oklahoma, near the Arkansas border. It was a change of scenery I welcomed. Greener terrain, more established infrastructure, fewer of the extreme isolation that had characterized my time in Texas. For 6 months, I settled into the routine of the position. Trail maintenance, forest management protocols, occasional lost hiker rescues. The work was solid and professional, exactly what I'd trained for. I tried to convince myself that the Texas incident had been an anomaly, a strange convergence of unusual wildlife behavior and camera artifacts that my mind had assembled into something more sinister. The Texas footage sat on my flash drive, untouched and unexamined. Then I received a call from Morris's daughter, Elena, through an unexpected connection. She'd tracked down my new contact information through Park Service records and reached out via email. We'd never spoken directly before. I'd only dealt with her father during my investigation. Her message was brief but urgent. She needed to talk to someone who believed her, someone who'd been involved with the situation at Big Bend. We met at a coffee shop in a small town about 2 hours south of my station. Elena was in her mid-20s, intelligent and direct, with the bearing of someone who'd grown up working land. She looked tired, like she wasn't sleeping well. "He's still out there," she said, not bothering with pleasantries once we'd ordered. The thing, it never left. It just got strategic. She explained that after the initial spree of kills, the attacks had continued sporadically across her father's property and neighboring ranches, but they'd become more selective, more deliberate. The creature would take one animal, usually at night, always with the same characteristic wounds, and it would always leave traces that made her father increasingly concerned about contamination, about disease. "My father thinks it's sick," Elena said. "Something about how it hunts, the way it leaves the blood trails. He thinks maybe it's carrying something. He won't let our dogs out after dark anymore. He installed motion lights around the entire perimeter of the property." "Has anyone tried to track it?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. 3 hunters came through in November. Local guys who'd heard the stories about livestock kills. They wanted to take a shot at whatever was doing it, get some trophy, maybe sell the story to someone. My father let them onto the land. Elena paused, her jaw tightening. 2 of them made it back. The third one, she trailed off, collecting herself. They found his body the next morning about a mile into the brush. He'd been attacked. The coroner said it was consistent with a mountain lion attack, but the hunters who survived said that was impossible. They said the wounds were wrong, the pattern was wrong, and they said the tracks around the body weren't from anything that lived in Texas. I felt my chest tighten. "Did they describe the tracks?" "3-toed," Elena said. "Like a bird's foot, but huge. Claws that dug deep into the hard ground, and the stride length suggested something moving on a lower angle than any 4-legged predator they'd ever seen." The description matched nothing in standard predator profiles. It sounded, impossibly, like something bipedal with avian characteristics. I thought of the infrared footage, the unusual spine curvature, the elongated head structure. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked carefully. "Because you saw it," Elena said. "I know you did. My father told me about the camera footage, about how you set up equipment and then transferred out immediately after. He's not stupid, and neither am I. You found something, documented it, and then ran." I didn't deny it. "What do you want from me?" "I want to know what it is," Elena said. "I want to know where it came from, and I want to know if there's any way to stop it from killing again." Over the next 2 hours, I told her everything. The dead javelina, the livestock losses, the trail cam footage, my own theories and fears. I showed her the video on my phone, watching her face as she processed what she was seeing. "It's here," she said finally. "It's established territory. It's not passing through. This is its home now." "The killings stopped," I said. "After the first month, they practically ceased." "But they didn't," Elena said. "That's what I'm telling you," they continued. "They're continuing. Just differently, more carefully." like it learned to hunt without attracting attention. After we parted, I spent weeks researching, late nights in my ranger station, using my personal laptop to dig into folklore databases, cryptozoology forums, anything that might provide answers. The term chupacabra appeared consistently in accounts from Puerto Rico, Mexico, and scattered reports from Texas and Arizona. The creature was described variously as a small alien visitor, a genetic mutation, a vampire creature from old colonial folklore reinterpreted for modern times. What struck me across all the accounts was the consistency of certain elements: the preference for livestock over humans, the selective nature of the attacks, the obsessive draining of blood, and in several historical accounts from Puerto Rico in the 1990s, there were descriptions matching what Elena had told me: a creature that learned to hunt more discreetly as awareness of its presence increased. One particularly detailed account from a retired Puerto Rican animal control officer described the creature as having a spinal ridge or series of protrusions along its back, a reptilian cast despite mammalian features, and an intelligence that suggested predatory calculation beyond what we'd expect from a wild animal. I saved everything to a secure folder on my encrypted drive, but I didn't go back to Texas. And I didn't reach out to Elena again, though I thought of her often. I told myself that my involvement would only complicate things, that the Park Service would never believe me, that I was better positioned to help by continuing my work and remaining credible within the system. Really, I was afraid. Afraid of what I'd glimpsed, afraid of what it meant, and terrified of the possibility that it might be aware of me, of my documentation, of my presence at the scene of its emergence. For 8 months, I maintained that fiction, work, routine, the comfortable illusion of normalcy. Then in late March, I received a call from the district office. There'd been a request for experienced rangers to assist with an unusual situation in West Virginia, some kind of wildlife management concern in the rural areas around Flatwoods. The assignment was voluntary, temporary. 3 weeks to help assess a situation and develop management protocols. The request specifically mentioned my background with unusual predator incidents and my documented expertise with cryptid-related wildlife management issues. Someone in the system somewhere had connected the dots. Someone knew what I'd encountered in Texas, and they were sending me to West Virginia. I should have refused. I should have claimed I was unavailable, uninterested, needed to focus on my current responsibilities. Instead, I said yes. Perhaps some part of me needed to know, needed to understand whether what I'd experienced was isolated or part of something larger, needed to confront the thing I'd been running from since I'd watched that 4-second infrared clip. I requested 3 weeks of leave. I packed a field kit, brought my cameras, and drove toward the Appalachian region with a growing sense that I was walking into something I wouldn't be able to walk away from. Flatwoods, West Virginia sits in the heart of the Appalachian region, a small community built around coal mining history and rural resilience. The town itself is unremarkable. Main Street has the usual collection of closed storefronts and aging businesses, with newer life concentrated in the outlying areas where people have relocated away from the declining urban core. My contact was a local ranger named Deputy Harlow, a man in his 50s who'd worked West Virginia forestry for 30 years. He met me at a diner in town and was immediately frank about why I was actually there. "We've got something that doesn't fit known animals," he said, stirring black coffee and not bothering with preamble. "Started getting calls about 5 weeks ago. Missing livestock, missing pets, tracks that don't match anything in our database. Rural families are scared, and the State Wildlife Commission is at a loss." "Why bring me in?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. "Because you filed a report about similar incidents in Texas. Your name came up in a search through the system, and because whoever requested your presence specifically said you'd encountered something similar before and would recognize the behavioral patterns." "Who requested me?" Harlow hesitated. "Someone high up in the National Park Service, not my chain of command. They sent a memo, and I was told to cooperate fully and not ask questions, which meant official interest, which meant I wasn't the only person who'd been taking this seriously." Harlow drove me through the rolling hills to the area where the incidents had been occurring. The landscape was heavily forested, dense woods broken by clearings where families had established small homesteads. It was beautiful in a way that felt ancient and watchful, as if the forest was conscious and merely tolerating human intrusion. We stopped first at a property where a family had lost several chickens and a goat. The owner, a woman named Margaret who lived alone on her 15 acres, was visibly frightened. She showed us where the goat had been found, in her barn where it couldn't have gotten out without human help. It had been drained of blood, the puncture marks arranged in a precise pattern that made my stomach turn. "It came into my barn," Margaret said, her voice small. "It came through a window that's been broken for a month, and I haven't fixed it because honestly I never expected. I didn't think," she trailed off, looking at the bloodstains on her barn floor. The tracks were visible in the soft earth around the barn's perimeter. Long, three-toed, with claw marks that suggested something moving with an avian stance. They were fresh, only hours old. I photographed everything extensively, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind screamed warnings. The tracks were identical to the description Elena had given me. The kill pattern matched the Texas incidents exactly. Whatever I'd encountered in Big Bend had either traveled to West Virginia or had a cousin equally deadly. Harlow watched me work with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was evaluating my credibility. When I looked up, he had an expression of grim confirmation. "You've seen this before," he said. It wasn't a question. "Similar, in Texas, 2 years ago." And I couldn't explain it then. I still can't. Over the next week, Harlow and I investigated 7 separate incidents. Each one followed the same pattern. Livestock killed overnight, blood loss consistent with controlled predation rather than wild attack, tracks that matched no known animal in the region. On the 3rd day, we found a trail camera that a local family had set up independently. It had captured footage of the creature entering a cattle enclosure. The footage was clearer than the Texas clip, better angle, better lighting. The creature was approximately the size of a large dog but with a completely alien body structure. The head was elongated and oddly shaped, with a profile that suggested a creature more reptilian than mammalian, despite obvious fur or scaled covering. The spine curved in an unnatural S-shape, and the legs bent at angles that suggested a hybrid anatomy, neither fully quadrupedal nor bipedal but some unsettling combination of both. But the eyes, when the creature looked directly at the camera, I saw the same phosphorescent reflection I'd captured in Texas. And more than that, I saw intelligence, deliberate, calculating awareness. The creature was looking at the camera. It knew it was being recorded. "What the hell is that?" Harlow whispered. "I don't know," I said. And it was the truth. I still didn't know, not in any official, taxonomic sense that would fit into the natural world as I understood it. That night I made a decision that cost me everything. I called Elena in Texas and told her I was in West Virginia, that I'd found the same creature, that it apparently had a wider range than either of us had suspected. "You have to document this formally," Elena said. "You have to report it up the chain. Make them take it seriously." "They won't," I said. "You know they won't. It will be dismissed, discredited, filed away as misidentification and hysteria." "Then what are you going to do?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. The incidents escalated after that. A family reported something large moving through their house at night. They heard it on the stairs, heard it at the bedroom door, heard it leave through a window. They left the property the next morning and didn't come back. Another family found tracks leading to their child's bedroom window, a window that had been locked from the inside. The creature was no longer just hunting livestock. It was hunting people. On the 10th day, Harlow and I set up an ambush. We positioned ourselves with tranquilizer rifles in a location where the creature's pattern suggested it would hunt that evening. We waited through the dark hours, barely breathing, weapons ready. At 2:34 a.m., something moved through the forest toward us. Not the creature, something else. Something that moved like a person, but wrong. The gait was uneven, the posture hunched, and when the moon broke through the clouds, I saw it clearly enough to understand what was happening. It was a man, or had been once. His body was wrong, twisted, deformed, moving with a jerky, uncoordinated motion that suggested catastrophic neural damage or something far worse. His eyes were vacant, and when his head turned toward us, I saw blood running from his nose, his mouth, his ears. "Oh God," Harlow whispered. "Oh God, is he infected?" The thing that had once been human collapsed 20 feet from our position. We rushed to him, abandoning the ambush, checking for vitals. He was alive but barely conscious. His temperature was dangerously elevated, his pulse erratic, and when he tried to speak, only blood came from his mouth. We called for emergency services, and he was airlifted to a hospital in Charleston. But before he left, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and whispered something I'll never forget. "In the blood. It's in the blood. It teaches you, it shows you, it wants." He lost consciousness before he could finish. The man died 3 hours later, despite the hospital's intervention. The cause of death was listed as acute infection and multi-organ failure, but the exact pathogen was never identified. The hospital's infectious disease team ran every test available. They found nothing they could explain. I knew what had killed him. The creature hadn't just bitten him, it had infected him, had introduced something into his system that the human body couldn't fight, and whatever that something was, it had been teaching his nervous system, rewriting his biology, and transforming him into something else. That night, I made the hardest decision of my career. I wrote a comprehensive report detailing every incident in Texas, every account in West Virginia, every photograph and video clip, every theory and observation. I included the trail cam footage, the autopsy findings, the behavioral analysis, all of it, and I sent it up the chain, directly to the assistant director of the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. Then I waited. The response came 48 hours later, in the form of 3 federal agents from an agency I wasn't familiar with. They didn't identify their department, didn't provide credentials, and spoke with the kind of authority that suggested they operated outside normal bureaucratic channels. They confiscated all my documentation, my cameras, my footage. They interviewed me for 6 hours, asking the same questions in different ways, obviously trying to identify inconsistencies in my account. Then they made it clear that I was to forget everything I'd documented, cease communication with Elena, and return to my regular duties as though none of this had happened. "What is it?" I asked them directly. "What is the creature? Where did it come from?" "That's not a concern for you anymore," one of them said, a woman with cold eyes and a bureaucrat's smile. "What you've experienced falls outside your jurisdiction and your pay grade. You're being transferred effective immediately. New assignment, new region, new paperwork. You'll sign several NDAs, and you'll understand that discussing this matter with anyone, including family, friends, or other Park Service employees, will result in immediate termination and legal action." I signed the documents. I didn't have a choice. The federal government has resources and leverage that a park ranger can't resist, but I kept one thing. A single photograph I'd taken on my personal phone, encrypted and hidden. A clear image of the creature from the Flatwoods trail camera, undeniable in its alien reality. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it, but I knew I couldn't let it disappear entirely. My new assignment was in northern Connecticut, managing a state forest in the rural areas near the New York border. I was there, ostensibly to improve trail infrastructure and conduct routine wildlife surveys. In reality, I was isolated from the network of people and information that had made me a liability. The transfer happened quickly. I was in Connecticut within 2 weeks of leaving West Virginia, set up in a ranger station that felt like a gilded cage, comfortable but isolated, safe but suffocating. For 3 months, I followed protocol. I did my job well, earned positive evaluations, and appeared to be exactly what the Park Service wanted, a competent, professional employee with no further interest in creatures that didn't fit the taxonomy. But the nightmares started almost immediately. I would dream of the infected man's face, of his blood-filled eyes, of the moment he understood that something alien had entered his body and was rewriting him from the inside. I would dream of the creature's phosphorescent gaze, of the intelligence behind it, of the horrible certainty that it was hunting with intention and purpose. I would dream of Elena's father on his porch, looking out at the scrubland where the thing moved unseen, and wake up gasping. Worse than the nightmares were the moments when I wasn't sleeping. I started researching obsessively, using encrypted browsers and private networks, digging deeper into cryptozoology databases, folklore accounts, and anomalous animal sightings. I was looking for a pattern, some unifying theory that would explain what I'd encountered. What I found was terrifying. The chupacabra sightings in Puerto Rico began in the 1990s, following reports of unusual livestock deaths in rural areas. The creature was blamed for thousands of livestock losses before the sightings gradually diminished in frequency. Similar patterns occurred in Mexico, in parts of Arizona, and in the areas surrounding Big Bend in Texas. In each location, the creature's presence lasted roughly 2-3 years before the sightings stopped. But they didn't stop because the creature left. They stopped because it learned to hide. The historical records of the Flatwoods monster dated back to 1952, when a group of boys in the area reported encountering a tall, gray, metallic-looking entity near the Sutton Farm in Flatwoods. The sightings proliferated in the 1950s and early 1960s before tapering off. But in the decades since, there had been scattered reports, always in rural areas, always involving livestock or pet deaths, always dismissed as misidentifications or hoaxes. I found accounts from Maryland in the 1970s, from Kentucky in the 1980s, from northern New York in the 2000s, different creatures by name, but the same behavioral pattern: arrival, predation, adaptation, invisibility. The creatures were intelligent. They were learning. What they were learning was how to exist alongside human populations without triggering our organized response. They were evolving their hunting strategies, spacing their kills, avoiding patterns that would draw investigation. They were becoming ghosts in the landscape, feeding on livestock and the occasional human foolish enough to wander into the wilderness alone. And according to my research, there were more of them than anyone admitted. At least 7 different creatures scattered across North America, each established in its own territory, each hunting in its own way. The chupacabra in the Southwest, the Flatwoods monster in the Appalachians, something called the Loveland frogman in Ohio, the Jersey Devil in New Jersey, and others. Names from folklore that had been dismissed as myth until you started looking at the evidence that suggested they were real, that they were organized, that they were perhaps not hunting according to wild animal behavior at all, but according to some system we didn't understand. In June, almost exactly 1 year after arriving in Connecticut, I received an email through an anonymous account I'd set up years before. The message contained only a link and a single line of text: "We know what you know. We need to talk." The link led to a secure messaging board, encrypted and untraceable, dedicated to documentation of cryptid sightings. But this wasn't a forum of hobbyists or believers. This was a network of experts, wildlife specialists, park rangers, indigenous representatives, and others who worked at the margins of official knowledge. I found accounts from people I recognized. Harlow was there, under an anonymous handle, documenting West Virginia incidents. A veterinarian from Puerto Rico detailing biological impossibilities in tissue samples. An indigenous elder from the Pacific Northwest describing creatures that tribal records suggested had coexisted with humans for centuries. And I found accounts from rangers dating back decades, all carefully documented, all describing creatures that didn't match any known animal, all describing the same behavioral patterns I'd observed, all describing official cover-ups and forced reassignments. There was a guide posted on the forum, a detailed analysis of the creature's behavior and characteristics. It was technical, careful, written with the precision of someone who'd spent years studying the phenomenon. The unknown author had categorized the creatures into 3 groups based on predation style and territorial range. The bloodletters, creatures like the chupacabra and Flatwoods monster, highly intelligent predators that drained blood from their prey, exhibited tool use, and demonstrated coordination with other members of their species. They were solitary hunters but appeared to communicate across long distances. The territorial hunters, creatures like the Jersey Devil and Loveland frogman, highly aggressive predators that claimed specific geographic areas and defended them violently. They killed more frequently but were more easily tracked and documented. The ghosts, creatures rarely documented or photographed, that operated at the absolute margins of human knowledge, that may have coexisted with indigenous populations for thousands of years with minimal human awareness. According to the guide, the bloodletters were the most recent arrivals. Archaeological evidence suggested they weren't native to North America at all. Decades of study had produced theories that they were either 1. Recent evolutionary adaptations from known animal species that had undergone rapid mutation, 2. Descendants of creatures that had existed in North America in prehistoric times and had hidden from human civilization, 3. Non-native species possibly introduced deliberately or accidentally that had established breeding populations. The guide's author favored Theory 3, suggesting that the creatures had been transported to North America through blood cultures, possibly by researchers in the early to mid-20th century. How this had happened, and whether it was deliberate or accidental, remained unknown. I spent weeks on that forum, reading accounts, comparing notes, documenting everything. I didn't post initially, just observed, but eventually I created a profile and made contact with the forum's administrator, an unknown individual who went by the name Sentinel. Sentinel responded within hours. After a series of verification questions designed to confirm I was actually a ranger with documented encounters, Sentinel offered to bring me into a private discussion group. There were 15 people in the group, all of us with direct experience with the creatures. What I learned over the course of several weeks of encrypted conversation changed everything I thought I understood about the natural world. The creatures weren't isolated anomalies. They were an established population, potentially thousands strong across North America, that had learned to coexist with human civilization by remaining hidden. They had territories, they had reproductive cycles, they had, and this was the most disturbing discovery, what appeared to be a form of social organization. Rangers and wildlife experts who'd been tracking them for decades had documented apparent pack behavior, possibly ritualistic activity at certain sites, and evidence suggesting they may have deliberately avoided public interaction while actively hunting livestock. They hunted in patterns, migrated seasonally, and appeared to select prey with deliberation. Most disturbing were the reports of infection. At least a dozen documented cases in the past 50 years of humans bitten or scratched by the creatures and subsequently developing acute neurological symptoms. In every case, the affected person had died within weeks. Autopsies revealed nothing. The pathological damage suggested some kind of parasitic infection, but no parasite could be identified. The damage was purely neurological, concentrated in the areas of the brain that controlled motor function and basic consciousness. The creatures were infecting their victims with something that reordered human neural architecture, something that the victim's immune system couldn't recognize or fight. One member of the group, a microbiologist who worked in a private capacity and whose name I was never given, offered a horrifying hypothesis. The creature's saliva contained proteins or microorganisms that were fundamentally incompatible with human neural tissue. The body's immune response to the infection was actually causing more damage than the infection itself. By the time symptoms appeared, the damage was irreversible. It's like their venom was never meant to affect humans, the microbiologist wrote. The damage is so catastrophic that it suggests their saliva evolved to target a completely different species. But when it's introduced to human neural tissue, it causes a cascade of destruction that no amount of medical intervention can stop. Which raised the question, what species were they meant to prey on? What had they evolved to hunt in their original environment? No one had an answer. By summer, I'd made contact with 8 people in the private group, and we were collaborating on a comprehensive documentation project. We were compiling everything, every sighting, every kill, every photograph and video, every piece of evidence that proved the creatures existed and were hunting in North America. We were doing what the federal government refused to do, treating them as a real phenomenon deserving serious study. But then, in July, the forum went dark. Sentinel's last message to the group came at 3 a.m. on July 16th. They're closing us down. If you see this message, assume your position is compromised. Take precautions. Destroy evidence you're comfortable losing. We'll rebuild elsewhere. The forum was gone 12 hours later. Every post deleted, every file removed, the entire system wiped, the encrypted channels stopped responding. It was as though the network had been surgically excised from the internet. I immediately removed all my research from my personal devices and made backups that I hid in multiple locations. I downloaded my communications with the group and stored them offline, encrypted with multiple layers of security. I deleted my browser history and covered my digital tracks as thoroughly as I could. But I knew they'd found us. The federal agencies or whoever they represented had discovered the network and shut it down with the kind of efficiency that suggested significant resources and authority. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from the Park Service informing me of another transfer, this time to Alaska, to a remote ranger station in the Denali region. The letter was professional but carried an implicit threat: comply with the transfer, ask no questions, and maintain absolute silence about your previous assignments. I requested a meeting with my supervisor before accepting the transfer. She was visibly uncomfortable, avoided eye contact, and made it clear that the decision came from above her level and wasn't subject to negotiation. "Is this a punishment?" I asked directly. "It's a reassignment," she said carefully, "to a position where your expertise with wilderness management would be valuable," which was bureaucratic speak for exile. I accepted the transfer. I packed my field equipment, my personal items, and drove to Alaska with a sense that I was being moved to the margins, away from information, away from the network, away from any ability to continue investigating what I'd learned. But before I left Connecticut, I did something that probably violated several of the NDAs I'd signed. I recorded a detailed account of everything I'd experienced, everything I'd learned, and everything I suspected about the creatures. I created multiple copies on encrypted thumb drives, and I mailed them to 3 addresses: Elena in Texas, the veterinarian from Puerto Rico whose screen name I'd identified through careful research, and the microbiologist whose specialty was untraceable biological warfare agents. I included a note with each package. If anything happens to me, release this information publicly. The world needs to know. It was a desperate act, probably futile, but it felt necessary. Even if I was isolated in Alaska, even if my network was dismantled and my research was confiscated, the truth would exist somewhere, encrypted and preserved, waiting for someone with the courage to expose it. I've been in Alaska for 8 months. I manage a section of Denali that encompasses roughly 200,000 acres of wilderness. It's beautiful, isolated, and completely removed from the infrastructure that allowed me to communicate with the research network. I've documented no unusual activity, no creature sightings, no unexplained predations, no evidence of anything beyond the normal wildlife population. But I've also received warnings. Every few weeks, I find something left at my ranger station, a dead animal, always bloodless, always positioned precisely in my doorway or at my window. A raven one morning, a moose calf another time, a grizzly bear cub the week before last. They're not hunted in any normal way. They're positioned like offerings, like messages, and I understand the message perfectly. I'm being watched. Even here, thousands of miles away from where I started, I'm within their awareness, their territory. Last month I began noticing tracks near my station, three-toed, avian-like, matching the creatures I've pursued across 2 different regions. I've photographed them, documented their locations, and maintained detailed records because I realized something crucial. The creatures don't live in the specific regions where they hunt. Territories span multiple states. The chupacabra moves between Texas and the areas I'm seeing in Alaska. The Flatwoods monster has been documented from West Virginia to the Canadian border. They're more migratory than sedentary, traveling along routes that may follow geological formations or magnetic anomalies or some system we don't understand. And Alaska, with its vast wilderness and minimal human population, may be one of their primary routes. I've stopped reporting unusual findings to the Park Service. There's no point. Any official report just triggers a federal response, and I've learned that the federal response is designed specifically to isolate information, not to understand it. Instead, I've dedicated myself to personal documentation. My encrypted drive now contains months of research, photographs, track casts, and behavioral analysis. I've been testing theories about the creature's migration patterns, attempting to predict where they'll appear next, and I've been thinking about what Elena said to me back when we first met. I want to know what it is. I want to know where it came from. And I want to know if there's any way to stop it from killing again. I've come to the conclusion that the creatures can't be stopped. Not by current human methods, not by the Park Service, not by any official agency. They're too intelligent, too adaptable, too deeply established in North American wilderness. But they can be understood, they can be tracked, they can be documented with the kind of rigor that eventually forces institutional acknowledgement. That's what I'm doing here, in the isolation of Alaska, where the creatures move freely and the distances are vast enough that I can follow them across an area where human interference is minimal. I've become, in essence, what the creatures have become. A ghost in the wild places, moving through territory where civilization barely exists, documenting a truth that the official world refuses to acknowledge. Sometimes I wonder if the creatures know I'm doing this, if they understand that I'm chronicling their existence, bearing witness to their presence in our world, whether that's why they leave me their gifts, the bloodless animals positioned at my door. Maybe it's gratitude. Maybe it's a warning. Maybe it's something I don't have the framework to understand. What I know with absolute certainty is this: the creatures are real. They exist in the wild places between civilization and true wilderness. They've learned to hunt us without revealing themselves, and they're still out there, in the forests and mountains and remote territories across North America, moving through the darkness with intelligence and purpose. And I will keep documenting their presence no matter what the cost. If you're reading this, if someone has found these files and chosen to release them despite the consequences, then you know the truth. The wilderness isn't empty. The folklore wasn't invented to scare children. There are things in the wild places that aren't in any official taxonomy. Things that hunt, things that think, things that perhaps in their own way are trying to understand us just as we're trying to understand them. And they're far closer than you've ever imagined. I took the ranger job at 2 Medicine 3 weeks after my grandfather's funeral. Jeremy Whitecalf had been a fire lookout on the eastern slope of the Rockies for 31 years. the longest tenure anyone in his district could remember. And when the cancer finally took him in March, he left me his Coleman stove, his old pair of binoculars, and a handwritten letter saying he hoped I'd find a reason to walk out of the city the way he had once found a reason to walk into the woods. I'd spent 6 years writing copy for an agency in Minneapolis. I had a Murphy bed and a tiny dog and a girlfriend who left me in February for a man who owned a sailboat. The week after the funeral, I drove past my reflection in the lobby mirror, and the man in it looked nothing like me. 2 months later, I had taken the federal exam, completed seasonal training at Mammoth, and accepted a posting at the Two Medicine subdistrict of Glacier National Park on the eastern boundary near the Blackfeet Reservation where my grandfather had grown up. I told myself the move was about him, about the letter, about sitting on the same porch he had sat on. I think now that it was simpler than that. I was tired in a way the city could not fix. Walter Fenwick met me at the gate. He was the senior ranger at Two Medicine, 62 years old, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of pine and then sanded only halfway. He was retiring at the end of the season. I was, in a sense, his replacement. "You're him," he said, and shook my hand. "The one with Jeremy's name on you." I said I had known my grandfather a little. "Everybody who knew him a little," Walter said. "He didn't let on much. Come on, I'll walk you up." The cabin sat a half-mile north of the lake along a service road that turned to mud in any rain heavier than a drizzle. It rested on a small rise, set back behind a stand of lodgepole pine, with a covered porch and a tin roof and a single window that looked east toward the water. From that window, on a clear morning, you could see Sonoma Mountain reflected on the surface of Two Medicine Lake like the mountain had a twin underneath it, sleeping. Walter showed me the wood stove and the radio and the gun safe with the bear spray and the rifle inside. He showed me the logbook, which went back 40 years, and a series of identical green hardcovers stacked on a shelf above the kitchen table. He showed me the cellar trapdoor, the generator, the satellite phone, the laminated topo map on the kitchen wall, and the small wooden box on the mantel that held 3 keys: cabin, gun safe, evidence locker at the substation. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and rolled a cigarette with the careful attention of a man who had done it 10,000 times. "3 things, he said. "Listen, don't make me tell you twice." "Sure." 1. Bears come through here in the fall. We are in their corridor. Don't leave food on the porch. Don't leave the truck unlocked with a sandwich in the cab. You will lose the cab." I nodded. 2. The Cobalt drainage is closed after dark. North Fork, past the Second Creek crossing. We don't write that on the maps. We tell people the trail is washed out, which it is. We tell them there's a grizzly sow with cubs, which there isn't. We tell them whatever keeps them out of there after sundown. You understand? "Why?" He looked at me. He had pale eyes, almost colorless, and they did not waver. "Because we lose people up there," he said. "We lose them and we don't find them. That drainage has taken 11 hikers since 1974 and we have recovered 4 bodies. The other 7 are gone, just gone, not in the lake, not in the meadows, not under the snowpack come spring, gone." He waited for me to say something. I did not. 3, he said. "If you hear someone calling your name out there at night, and you are alone, and you have not seen them with your own eyes in the last hour, you do not answer. You do not call back. You go inside, you lock the door, you turn the radio up, and you wait for sunrise." I almost laughed. I caught it in time. "That a Blackfeet thing? From my grandfather's people?" Walter lit his cigarette and looked at me for a long moment over the match. "It's a Two Medicine thing," he said. "From everybody's people. Your grandfather's people, my people, the Norwegians who built that road. You answer your name out there at night, and sometimes you walk into the trees, and you don't come back." He left at sunset. I watched his truck go down the service road, taillights bobbing in the ruts, until the trees took him. I made coffee on the wood stove because the propane line needed bleeding and I didn't feel like crawling under the cabin to do it. I sat on the porch with a mug and the binoculars and watched the light leave the lake. The water turned from green to slate to the color of an old nickel. A loon called from the far shore, the long aching note that always sounds like a question. Around 10 I went inside. I read 3 pages of a paperback. I checked the radio. I turned off the lamp and lay in the bunk and listened to the cabin settle, the slow ticks and creaks of a building learning a new occupant. I had been almost asleep when I heard him. The voice came from the direction of the lake, soft and clear, the way a voice carries across water at night. 2 syllables. My name, the way only my grandfather had ever said it, with the slight pause between the M and the rest of it, the way nobody else in my family had ever bothered to learn. Motto. I sat up in the dark. I did not move for a long minute. It came again, a little closer. Motto. Come down to the water. I lay back. I did not answer. I stared at the rafters and I thought about Walter's pale eyes and the cigarette burning down between his fingers and the way he had not looked away when he said the word gone. And I thought about my grandfather, who had been buried in March in the cemetery on the reservation under a blanket of late wet snow, and who could not be calling me from the lake. The voice did not come again that night, but it came back. The call came at 4:17 in the morning, 18 days after I moved into the cabin. The radio cracked once in its bracket on the kitchen wall, and I was up and standing in the dark with my pants in my hand before I was awake enough to know it. Dispatch was a woman named Ruth Gunderson out of West Glacier. She had a smoker's voice and a calm that made every emergency sound, for a moment, like an inconvenience. To Medicine, this is West. We have an overdue. Solo hiker, day pass for Cobalt Lake. Signed in yesterday at 09:15. Vehicle still at trailhead. Family called the park around midnight. I have been trying to raise you for an hour. You copy? I said I copied. I said the radio had been quiet. I checked the line and the volume and the set, and everything was fine. The radio had not been quiet. I was at the trailhead at 5:04. Tessa Iverson met me there in the second truck. She was 26, a third-season ranger, blonde and tall, and the kind of competent that makes other competent people feel slow. She had grown up in Whitefish, worked summers at the park since she was 19, and could read a topo map the way most people read the front page of a paper. Austin Delgado, she said, handing me the day pass copy. 41, Albuquerque, solo. Family says he hikes alone all the time, no medical conditions, experienced. Trail to Cobalt is under 5 miles each way. He should have been back by sundown. He sign in for the lake or the upper drainage. She did not look at me when she answered. Lake, and the vehicle, still here. We walked the trail in the dark with headlamps. The Cobalt Trail climbs hard for the first mile, a series of switchbacks through fir and lodgepole, and at every switchback I had the impulse to turn around and look behind me and could not have said why. The forest was very still. A pre-dawn forest in summer should not be still. There should be a wind in the upper branches, the click and chirp of small things, the occasional rustle of a chipmunk losing its mind over nothing. We had none of that. Our boots on the gravel were the only sound, and they sounded loud. Tessa noticed it before I did. No birds, she said. We hiked for an hour and 20 minutes, and we did not hear a single bird. We found him at the second creek crossing. He was sitting in the middle of the trail with his back against a boulder, and his pack was 30 feet away on the wrong side of the creek, and his trekking pole was broken in 2 pieces, and his eyes were open and he was breathing. When I knelt next to him, he did not turn his head. He looked past me, at a point on the slope above the trail, at nothing. Austin, Tessa said. Austin, can you hear me? We're rangers. We're going to get you out. He did not answer. I checked his pulse, which was fast but steady. I checked his hands, which were cold but unbroken. I checked his pupils, which responded normally. He was conscious. He was not in shock in any way I had been trained to recognize. He was simply not speaking. We got him on his feet. He walked when we steered him. He drank water when Tessa held the bottle to his lips. He did not look behind us, which was strange because every hiker we have ever pulled out of that drainage looks behind them at least once on the way down. We were a quarter mile from the trailhead, just past the last switchback, when I heard my name. It came from the slope to our right, in Austin Delgado's voice. Motto, I'm up here, please. Austin Delgado was holding my arm. I could feel his hand. He was looking straight ahead and walking, and his mouth was closed. The voice on the slope said it again. Motto, please. I twisted my ankle. I can't get down. Tessa stopped walking. She had heard it too. She looked at me, and then at Austin, and then at me again, and she did not say anything because her face had gone the kind of pale you only see when someone understands a thing very fast. We have to keep moving, I said. Motto, the voice said. You can hear me. I know you can hear me. I'm bleeding, man. Please. Austin's hand on my arm tightened. He did not look up. He started to walk faster. We got him to the truck. We got him in the back seat with Tessa and a wool blanket. I drove down the service road faster than I should have, and behind us the trees went by in long dark walls, and Austin Delgado did not say a word and did not look behind him, not once. At the substation, in the light, he finally spoke. He was sitting on the gurney and his hands were shaking, and he looked up at me with the expression of a man who has just realized he has been carrying something heavier than he thought. "It learned my voice," he said. I waited. "It was at the lake," he said. "It was on the other side. I heard a kid crying. I went around to help and there was no kid. There was just—" He stopped. He looked at the wall. I started back. It started using my voice. It walked behind me. It walked behind me for 9 miles. It said please, and it said help me, and it said my wife's name. My wife's name. How does it know my wife's name? I did not have an answer. It was learning, he said. It wasn't good at it at first. It got better. By the time you found me, it sounded like me. Did it sound like me? It sounded like you, I said. He nodded. He looked relieved, in a way that was not relief. I thought maybe I went crazy, he said. I drove back to the cabin alone at sundown. I did not stop at the trailhead. I did not look at the slope where the voice had come from. I sat on the porch that night with the rifle across my knees and the radio on, and the loon called from the far side of the lake, and somewhere behind the cabin, in the trees, something cleared its throat. I drove to the reservation on my next day off. Jesse Running Crane lived in a single-story house on the north side of Browning, with a chain-link fence around a yard of dirt and crabgrass, and a black dog that watched me from under the porch without barking. He was 84. He had known my grandfather since they were both 7 years old. At the funeral, he had been the only man in the family who did not cry, not because he didn't feel it, but because, he told me later, he had used up his crying for Jeremy Whitecalf 2 years before, when he saw what the cancer was going to do. He was on the porch when I pulled up. He had a glass of iced tea and a baseball game on a transistor radio. The dog came out from under the porch and sniffed my boots and then went back under. "You look like him in the morning light," Jesse said. "Sit down." I sat. "I need to ask you something," I said. "About 2 medicine." He looked at me for a long time. Then he turned off the radio. "Tell me what you heard," he said. I told him. I told him about the first night and the voice from the lake. I told him about Austin Delgado and the slope above the trail. I told him about the throat clearing in the trees behind the cabin, and about the way the birds had stopped, and about Walter Fenwick's 3 rules, and about the way I had been sleeping with the rifle for 10 days. He listened the way old men listen when they have heard a thing before, which is to say he did not interrupt and his face did not change. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "My grandmother, who was born the year that your American President Cleveland was first elected, told me that there are things in those drainages that are older than the people. She said when the people came down out of the north, the things were already there. She said the people learned to leave the things alone, and the things learned to leave the people alone, and that this was a kind of agreement." He took a sip of his tea. "She said that the agreement gets thin sometimes. She said in winters when the elk are sick and the snow is deep, the agreement gets very thin. She said when you hear your name out there, it is the agreement getting thin." "What are they?" I said. "They are not anything," he said. "They are not bears and they are not wolves and they are not the spirits of the dead. They are something my grandmother did not have a word for, and I do not have a word for, and I think it is a mistake to give a thing a word that it does not have, because then you think you understand it." "What did your grandmother call them?" He smiled, very faintly. "She called them the listening ones," he said, "because they listen, and then they say back." I sat with that for a minute. "How do I make them stop?" "You do not make them stop," he said. "You do what your grandfather did. He worked his lookout for 31 years. He never answered his name once. He kept his radio on at night because they do not like the sound of human noise that they cannot copy. He never went into Cobalt drainage after dark. He told me once that he saw one of them in 1979, in the moonlight, on the far ridge, and that he could not tell me what he had seen because he did not have the words for it, but that he wished he had not seen it." "Did he answer? Ever?" "Once," Jesse said. "I waited. In 1981, he said. He had a son, not your father's older brother. You did not know him. He died at 23 in Vietnam. Your grandfather did not know yet. He was at the lookout, and he heard the boy's voice from the trees calling for him, and he answered. He went down. He spent 3 nights in the woods looking for a son who was already 3 weeks dead in a hospital in California. When he came out, his hair was white. It had been black going in. He was 38 years old. I did not say anything. They use what is in you," Jesse said. "They use the voices you would walk toward without thinking. They are very patient. They learn you slowly, and then one night they use everything they have learned at once." I drove back to 2 Medicine in the late afternoon. The light over the eastern slope was the color of copper and the wind was up, and the lodge poles bent in long even waves like grass in a field. I read the cabin logbooks that night. I read them all, every one, going back to 1978, and I found the same handwriting in different hands across decades. I found rangers writing about voices on the lake and voices on the trail and voices at the cabin door. I found one entry in 1994 from a ranger named Sean Heffernan that said, 3 nights running now, calling Linda. Linda is my wife. Linda is in Spokane. I will not answer. I will not answer. I will not. There was no entry from Sean Heffernan after that. I called the park archive in West Glacier the next day and asked about him. The archivist said he had transferred out at the end of that season. He had not. I checked the federal personnel database. Sean Heffernan had separated from service on August 14, 1994, with no forwarding address. He had been 42. His wife Linda Heffernan of Spokane had filed a missing persons report on August 19. It was still open. That night something walked on the porch. It walked the full length of it, slowly, from the door to the rail, and it stopped at the window. I lay in the bunk with the rifle, and I did not move. I heard it breathing. The breath was wrong. It was too slow and too deep, and it had a small click in it at the end of every inhale, the way a tape recorder clicks when it reaches the end of a reel. It said my name in my mother's voice. My mother had died when I was 9. I did not answer. After a long time it walked back along the porch and down the steps and into the trees, and I lay in the bunk until the light came up and I did not sleep. The storm came in on the 14th of August. It came down out of the northwest off the Livingston Range and the radio said 3 days, but the radio was wrong. It was 4. 4 days of rain so heavy the road washed out at the second culvert, and the satellite phone lost signal because the dish on the substation got shifted by the wind, and the only contact I had with the outside world was the VHF radio and the patience of Ruth Gunderson, who checked in every 6 hours and told me in her smoker's voice that I should sit tight and not be a hero. I had food. I had water. I had wood split for the stove and the generator topped off and the rifle loaded and the bear spray on the kitchen table. I did not have nerve. I had run out of that on the second night. It started small. A scratching at the back wall of the cabin, low down near the cellar trap. I told myself it was a porcupine. Porcupines chew the salt out of the wood at the corners of cabins. It is a thing they do. I told myself this for 40 minutes while I sat at the kitchen table with the rifle pointed at the back wall, and then the scratching stopped and a voice from the cellar trap said, very softly, Mato, it's Walter. The road's washed. I came up to check on you. Open up, son. I'm soaked. Walter Fenwick had retired 3 weeks before. He had moved to Kalispell to live with his daughter. I had his cell number. I had called him 2 days earlier. He was in Kalispell. I did not answer. Mato, the voice said. Don't be stupid, son. I drove up the long way. I know about your situation. Open the trap. Walter had never called me son. Walter called me kid when he was being friendly and white calf when he was being a ranger. He did not say son. Son was what my grandfather had called me. I sat at the table, and I did not move and I did not answer. After about 10 minutes, the voice said, in a different tone, almost conversational, all right? Then it was quiet. Then half an hour later, it was my grandfather. It came from the porch this time. The same 2 syllables, the same pause, the same exact intonation I had heard at midnight in his kitchen when I was 12 years old and he was calling me in for stew. I had not heard that voice in 9 years. I had not heard it since the hospital, in the last week, when he could still talk a little. I sat at the table and I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. Mato, come out, boy. It's just me. My grandfather had never used the word boy. Mato, I miss you. Come out. My grandfather had never used the word miss. It was getting it almost right. It was getting it 90% right. It was the missing 10% that kept me in the chair, that kept the rifle pointed at the door, that kept me alive, I think, although I am not sure what alive means in that cabin during those 4 days. The rain came down. The voice on the porch went away and came back as Tessa Iverson, asking me to open the door because she had hiked up to check on me and her radio was dead, and I knew Tessa was at her mother's house in Whitefish because she had told me on the radio that morning. The voice as Tessa was not as good. It was almost right. It was wrong in a way I could not name. It was wrong the way a photograph of a person is wrong if you look at it for too long. The voice was Austin Delgado, calling me from the road, saying he had come back for his pack and gotten lost. The voice was Ruth Gunderson, which it could not have been, because Ruth was in West Glacier 80 miles away. The voice was a child's, a small child, crying from the direction of the lake. That last one almost got me out of the chair. I was halfway up before I caught myself. There were no children at 2 Medicine. There were no children at the campground, because the campground was closed for the storm. The nearest child was probably 40 miles away in East Glacier. A child crying at my cabin in a 4-day rain was not a child. I sat back down. On the third night, the voices stopped. There was a long quiet, maybe 4 hours, in which I almost slept. Then something walked past the kitchen window. I saw it for less than a second. The lamp was on, low, and the rain had eased, and something tall went past the window from left to right, between the glass and the trees. I saw the shape of it against the dim outside. It was the wrong shape. It was tall, and it was thin, and it walked on 2 legs, but the legs bent in too many places, and the head was held forward and low, and the arms were too long, and the skin was the white of a thing that had not seen the sun. I do not know what I saw. I have told myself 100 times in the year since that I saw a man in a poncho, that I saw a moose at a strange angle, that I saw my own shadow moving across the lamp. I have not convinced myself. I sat at the table the rest of the night with the rifle across my lap and the safety off, and I did not move, and I did not look at the window again. On the 4th morning, the rain stopped and the road dried enough to drive, and Tessa came up in her truck with 2 more rangers and a tow chain, and they found me at the table where I had been for the better part of 2 days. Tessa took one look at me and didn't say anything. She made coffee. She fed me. She drove me down to the substation and put me in a room with a heater and a sleeping bag. I slept 14 hours. When I woke up, I told her I would like to give my notice. She told me she would be sad to see me go. She told me also that I should know that 2 more hikers had been reported overdue in the Cobalt drainage during the storm. They had not been seen since. She had a search team going up the next morning. I told her I would go with them. I do not know exactly why I said that. I think I was tired of being afraid in a chair. We went in at dawn. There were 5 of us. Tessa, me, 2 rangers from the West Glacier substation named Brian Breivik and Carol Lindquist, and a search dog handler named Billy Forsberg with a Belgian Malinois called Vesta. The sky was the color of wet cement. The trail was washed in places and ran with thin water in others, and our boots made a steady sucking sound in the mud. The hikers we were looking for were a married couple, Bruce and Devra Petrov, both in their 30s, both experienced. They had signed in for an overnight at Cobalt Lake, last seen by another party at around 6 in the evening on the day the storm started. They had been 5 days overdue. We climbed for 2 hours. The dog ranged ahead and came back and ranged ahead and came back, and at the second creek crossing she stopped. She would not go past it. Billy knelt and spoke to her and tried to coax her forward, and Vesta did the thing dogs do when they are absolutely not going to do something, which is to sit down and look past the thing they will not approach as if it does not exist. That has never happened with her, Billy said. He sounded, for the first time, uncertain. We left him with the dog and we went on. The Cobalt Lake Basin opens up about a mile past the second crossing. It is a glacial cirque, blue-green water in a bowl of granite, with a spur trail that goes up to a ridge above the lake and then down into the upper drainage that is closed at sundown. The Petrovs' camp was on the eastern shore, and it was undisturbed, and that was the first wrong thing. Their tent was up. Their packs were inside the tent. Their food bag was in the bare hang where they had left it. Their stove was clean. The fire ring had cold ash from a small fire that had been allowed to burn down properly. They had gone to bed in their tent and not come out. There was no sign of struggle. There was no sign of them at all. Tisa called it into West. We searched the shoreline. We searched the meadow. We searched the lower slopes of the ridge. We found in the soft mud at the edge of the lake 2 sets of footprints going north, into the upper drainage, side by side and close together, the way you walk with someone you are holding hands with. The footprints went past the trailhead sign that said TRALAL closed. They went into the upper drainage. We followed them. I do not know how to describe the upper drainage at midday under a sky the color of wet cement. The trees were old up there, older than they had any right to be at that elevation, and they did not move in the wind even though there was a wind. The trail, such as it was, ran up a creek bed that was full of black water. We did not hear birds. We did not hear insects. We heard the creek and our boots and our breathing. Brian, who was the youngest of us, kept turning around to look behind himself. We walked for an hour and 20 minutes. We found Devra Petrov in a clearing. She was sitting against a deadfall with her hands in her lap. She was wearing the clothes she had hiked in. Her boots were neat, Her hair had been combed recently with a comb that was lying on the log beside her. Her eyes were open and she was breathing slowly. She did not turn her head when we came into the clearing. She did not turn it when Tessa knelt next to her. She did not turn it when Tessa shone a flashlight in her face. She was alive. She was unhurt. She was somewhere else. Caro stayed with her. The rest of us went on. The footprint trail ended 50 yards past the clearing. There was nothing else. No drag marks, no second body, no torn clothing, no blood. Bruce Petrov had walked out of the clearing where his wife was sitting and had not walked anywhere a foot can leave a print. Behind us, at the lake, very faintly, I heard a man's voice call, "Devra, Devra, it's all right. I'm here." I had not met Bruce Petrov. I had seen one photograph of him, from the day pass intake form. He had been a tall man with a black beard. The voice came again closer. "Devra, sweetheart." Tessa looked at me. Brian was holding his rifle now. "We are going down," Tessa said. "We are going down right now. Brian, take point. Mato, you bring up the rear. We do not stop. We do not look up the slope. We do not answer anything we hear. Move." We went down. We had to carry Devra. She did not struggle, and she did not help. She was a weight in our arms. Halfway back to the lake, a voice from the trees on the right said, in a voice I knew, "Mato, it's Grandpa. Mato, son, help me." I have spent a year trying to describe what that voice did to my chest, and I have not been able to. My grandfather and I had walked these woods together when I was 12. I had heard him call me from 100 yards off when he wanted me to come look at a porcupine in a tree. I knew that voice the way I know my own face in a mirror. The voice in the trees was my grandfather's voice exactly. It was perfect. The 10% that had been wrong 4 days ago was not wrong anymore. It had been listening. It had gotten better. I did not answer. I did not look up the slope. I walked. At the lake we put Devra in a sling and carried her down. Billy met us at the second crossing with the dog. The dog would not look up the trail. She would not even point her head in that direction. She walked between us with her eyes on the ground. We got out at sunset. Devra Petrov was airlifted to Kalispell. She is in a long-term care facility there. She has not spoken since we found her. She eats when she is fed and she walks when she is led, and she does not turn her head. And the doctors there have used the words catatonia and fugue state and dissociative break, and none of those words are the right word, and I do not have the right word either. Bruce Petrov was never found. I did not give my notice. I am writing this in the cabin at 2 Medicine in late July of the following year. On the laptop the park gave me for incident reports. Walter Fenwick is dead. He had a heart attack in February. Jesse Running Crane is 95 and still on his porch in Browning, and he asked me the last time I visited whether I had answered yet, and when I said no he nodded and said, "Then you are still here." The voices still come. They come less in summer. They come almost every night in winter. They come in my grandfather's voice mostly, and in my mother's, and sometimes in voices I do not recognize, calling names I do not know. They come from the lake. They come from the porch. Once last December, one of them came from inside the cabin, from the cellar, and said my name in my own voice, and that was the worst night of my life. I keep the radio on. I do not answer. I sleep when I can. In the spring my replacement is supposed to arrive. A young man from Bozeman with a clean record and a degree in wildlife biology. I do not know what I will tell him. I think I will tell him the 3 things Walter told me, and then I think I will tell him a 4th. The 4th thing is this. There is something in those mountains that does not love us and does not hate us and is patient in a way that is older than patience. It listens, it learns, it uses what it has learned, and the only thing you can do, when it calls you in a voice you would walk toward without thinking, is to sit very still in the dark and not move and not speak and wait for the morning. Because the morning still comes. That is the agreement, and the agreement, for now, is holding. For now. I took the job because my father wore the same gray and green uniform for 31 years, and because the man I had become in Spokane no longer recognized himself in the bathroom mirror. That is the short answer. The long answer involves a stack of insurance claim files I left on a desk on a Tuesday in March, a phone call from my mother's hospice nurse, and a drive north on Highway 93 in a truck that smelled like cold coffee and old paper. I rolled into the ranger station at Polebridge on the 2nd of April, my badge unissued, my hands still soft from a decade of fluorescent rooms. My name is Tyler Whitehorse. My grandmother gave me that name in the Blackfeet way before she gave me any English one, and it means something close to the rumble that rolls down off the mountains before the snow lets go. I have lived in Montana most of my life, but I had been gone long enough that the smell of the lodgepole had started feeling like a memory of a place I dreamed about, instead of the actual woods I was about to walk into. The North Fork district of Glacier National Park is the kind of country where cell phones go to die. The road in from Columbia Falls is 40 miles of washboard gravel that loosens your fillings if you take it faster than 30. There are bears on it, there are moose on it. In summer there are tourists who think their rented Jeep can do anything and have to be pulled out of ditches by men like me. The cabin assigned to me sits about 3 miles past the end of the road, on a spur trail that nobody maintains except us. It overlooks the south end of a long, narrow lake, and it was built in 1933 by men with hand tools and no insurance. The wood is still good. The roof leaks above the kitchen, but only when the snow turns to slush. I arrived in late afternoon. Aaron Calder, the senior ranger for the district, met me on the porch with a cup of black coffee and a tin mug and a look I would come to know well, a look that meant he was already deciding how much to tell me. He was 61 years old, a Crow man on his mother's side, and he had been a ranger longer than I had been alive. He shook my hand without smiling. "Your father was a careful man," he said. "I worked 2 seasons with him on the east side." He did not say much. "No," I said, "he did not." "Good?" Aaron nodded once and walked me into the cabin. Inside, the place smelled of cedar and propane and the faint mineral edge of the old cast-iron stove. There was a single bunk in the back room, a shelf of paperback westerns from the 70s, a hand-cranked radio, and a topographical map pinned to the wall with thumbtacks rusted into small stars. The window over the kitchen sink looked across a strip of meadow to the lake, which was the color of slate that day, with a wind moving on it. Aaron went over the basics: the radio frequencies, the bear protocol, the location of the spare key, which lived under a particular stone by the woodpile, although there was no real reason to lock the cabin since the nearest thief was 80 miles away. He paused at the door, hand on the jamb, and he said, "3 rules out here, Whitehorse. You ready?" "Sure." 1. Never pass the upper pour-off in the Bowman drainage after dark, no matter what you hear coming from it. 2. If you find anything in the woods that looks placed instead of fallen, you do not touch it. You mark it on your map and you walk away and you tell me. And 3. He looked at me for a long moment, and I noticed his eyes were a very tired brown, the kind of brown that has watched too many sunrises alone. If you hear someone call your name and you cannot see who is calling, you do not answer. Not the first time, not the 10th time. Not if it sounds like me, not if it sounds like your mother. You do not answer. You walk. I waited for him to laugh, or to say it was a hazing routine for new rangers. He did not. He stepped off the porch, crunched gravel under his boots, climbed into his green truck, and left me alone with the lake. That first night I cooked a can of chili on the stove and ate it standing at the window. The lake went black before the sky did. I have noticed this about northern lakes. The water swallows the last light a long time before the trees give it up. I read for an hour, then I lay down in the bunk in my long underwear and listened. The cabin makes its own noises. Joists settle. The stove ticks. A pine cone hits the metal roof and sounds, for one heart-stopping second, like a footstep. None of that bothered me. I had grown up with such sounds. What bothered me came at about 1:15 in the morning. I heard a voice from somewhere out past the meadow, somewhere down by the lake or just inside the first line of trees. It was a man's voice. It said my name. It did not shout it. It said it the way my father had said it, when I was 14 and he wanted me to come help him stack firewood. Quiet, familiar, patient. My father has been dead 9 years. I lay in the bunk and I did not move. After a minute the voice said my name again in exactly the same tone, with exactly the same small upward lift on the second syllable. Then it said it a third time. The intervals between were perfectly even. I counted them in my head, the way you count the seconds between lightning and thunder. 42 seconds, 42 seconds, 42 seconds. I thought about Aaron's third rule, and I felt my mouth go dry and I did not answer. After about 20 minutes the voice stopped, or it moved. I could not tell which. I lay there until the gray of the false dawn came into the window, and I listened to my own breathing, and I thought about every reasonable explanation a reasonable man can think about, and none of them survived. When the sun came up, I got out of bed and I made coffee, and I walked the meadow to the lake. The grass was bent with frost. There were no human tracks. There were no animal tracks either, which I found stranger than anything else I had ever seen in the woods, and I have seen a great many things in the woods. I went back to the cabin. I picked up the radio. I keyed it twice. Then I set it down without speaking. I needed to think before I told anyone anything. 3 days into my posting, the call came in over the morning radio check. 2 backpackers, husband and wife, due back at the Pole Bridge Ranger Station the previous evening. They had filed an itinerary for the Numa Ridge Loop, a 3-day trip that climbs out of Bowman Lake and crosses a section of high meadow before dropping back down to the trailhead. People miss check-ins all the time. They twist an ankle, they sit out a thunderstorm, they lose track of a day. Most of them walk out by lunchtime on the day of the call, embarrassed and hungry. So I was not too worried when Aaron's voice came through the static and told me to meet him at the Bowman trailhead at 0800. The hikers were named Jerry and Annika Ostman. They were from Minneapolis. I remember this because I have not forgotten any of the names even now, although I have tried. Aaron and I started up the trail together. The morning was cold, and the larch needles had begun to turn in places, although it was still early in the season for that. We found their first campsite at the lower lake outlet, undisturbed except that the fire pit was cold and the food bag was still hanging from the bare pole. People do not leave a food bag on the pole when they leave camp. They take their food with them or they pack it. They do not leave it. Aaron's mouth got tight when he saw it. He took the bag down. The food inside was untouched. There was a paperback novel in a plastic bag, a box of Strike Anywhere matches, and 4 energy bars. There were also 2 unwashed bowls in the fire pit area, with the spoons still in them. The oatmeal had dried solid. They had breakfast, I said, and then they did not pack. Aaron did not answer me. He looked at the trees on the far side of the clearing for a long time. We pushed on up the trail. About a mile farther, in a section of old burn where the standing dead pines made a kind of gray cathedral, we found Annika's day pack. It was sitting at the base of a snag, upright, the shoulder straps neatly tucked under the body of the pack. Aaron did not touch it. He stood about 10 feet away from it and turned in a slow circle. He looked at the trail behind us. He looked at the trees. He took out his radio and called in our position to the ranger station and asked for a second team to start up from the trailhead. Then he looked at me and he said, "Tyler, we are going to walk back the way we came. We are not going to discuss this until we are off the ridge. If you hear my voice from anywhere I am not, you keep walking and you do not look. Do you understand?" I understood. I did not like it, but I understood. We started back. We had been walking maybe 10 minutes, side by side, when I heard Aaron's voice say, very clearly, from somewhere off to our left in the burn, "Tyler, over here, come look at this." Aaron was right next to me. His mouth had not moved. His hand was on my forearm like a bear trap. I think that was the moment I stopped being a man who had grown up hearing stories from his grandmother and started being a man who was inside one. We did not stop walking. We did not turn our heads. The voice repeated the sentence about a minute later. Exactly the same words, exactly the same pitch, from a slightly different direction. It was matching our pace. It said it a third time, from somewhere ahead of us now, as if it had circled. Aaron's grip on my forearm did not slacken until we were back down at the lower campsite, and then he let go and bent over with his hands on his knees and breathed for about a full minute before he straightened up. "How long," he said, "since you got here, has it been working on you?" "The first night," I said. "It learns fast," he said. "It is patient. It listens. It collects voices the way a magpie collects shiny things. And once it has yours forever." We did not find Jerry or Annika that day or the next. The other team came up from the trailhead and we swept the loop with 8 people and 2 dogs. The dogs would not enter the burn. They sat down on the trail at the edge of the dead trees and they whined. And the handler, a calm woman from Kalispell who had worked tracking for 15 years, said she had never seen them do that before, and she did not push them. On the 3rd day of the search, we found Jerry. He was sitting against a tree about 400 yards off the trail, in a thicket so dense we walked past him twice before one of the volunteers caught the orange of his jacket. He had not been mauled. He had not fallen. There was no obvious injury. He was simply sitting there. And he had been sitting there long enough that the chipmunks had begun to take an interest in his bootlaces. The county coroner ruled it exposure. He had a wedding ring on. He had no pack. He had no shoes. His socks were on. The socks were not even dirty. Annika we never found. Her name went onto the list of people who have walked into the North Fork country and never walked back out. A list that is longer than the Park Service likes to admit and that goes back, when you really start to look at the old records, well over 100 years. The night after we recovered Jerry, I sat on the porch of my cabin and watched the dark settle over the meadow. The lake was very still. I had a shotgun across my knees. I am not ashamed of that. I had a thermos of coffee and the radio on the windowsill behind me turned low. About an hour past sunset, Aaron's voice came out of the trees. It said, "Tyler, open the door. It is cold out here." I sat. I did not move. I did not call out. I did not key the radio. The voice tried 4 more times with different sentences. Each one was something Aaron might plausibly have said. Each one was perfectly accurate to his cadence, his slight crow inflection on certain vowels, the small dry cough he sometimes did before he started a sentence. The 5th attempt, the voice said, "Whitehorse, you better hope I never need you to open this door for real." That one almost got me. That one was good. I sat. I did not answer. After a long time, the voice stopped. In the morning, I called Aaron on the radio at his cabin 12 miles down the road. He had been asleep since 9 the previous evening. He had not left his bed. He told me, again very calmly, never to answer. 2 weeks passed. The work of a ranger, even in a haunted place, is mostly the work of any other working man. I cleared Blowdown off the trail. I cited 2 parties for camping outside designated sites. I helped a French couple whose rented camper had bottomed out on a culvert. And I rode into Polebridge twice for groceries and to use the satellite phone to check on my mother in her hospice bed in Kalispell. She did not have many days left. She knew it. She told me, the second time I called, that she had been seeing my father in the doorway of her room at night, and that he had been waiting for her, and that she did not feel any kind of fear about it at all. I did not know what to say to that, so I said, "I love you, Ma," and she said, "I know, Tyler. Be careful out there." It was the next night that the woman came to my door. It was raining, the kind of slow, steady, cold rain that the high country gets in late spring, and I was reading by the lantern when I heard footsteps cross the porch. They were dragging slightly, like one foot was bad. I set the book down. I did not pick up the shotgun, which is a thing I have thought about many times since. There was a knock. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. Then a woman's voice said, hoarse and tired, "Hello? Is somebody there, please? I am so cold." I opened the door. She was about 35 years old, soaked through, with dark hair plastered to her forehead, wearing a gray fleece jacket and jeans and 1 hiking boot. Her other foot was in a wet sock. Her face was pale, but it was a normal pale, the pale of a person who had been outside in the rain too long. Her eyes were the color of weak tea. "My name is Mara," she said. "Mara Vesper. I got separated from my husband at Kintley yesterday afternoon. I have been walking. I saw your light. I let her in. Of course I let her in. She was shivering. I wrapped her in a wool blanket from the bunk. I sat her by the stove. I poured her coffee. I asked her the basic questions. She answered them. The answers were good. She knew the trail names. She knew her husband's name, which was Adin. She knew the make of their rental car. She thanked me, with what looked like real exhaustion, for the coffee. But, after about 10 minutes, I started to notice things. The first thing I noticed was that she was not actually drinking the coffee. She held the mug in both hands, and she lifted it to her lips at appropriate intervals, but the level in the mug did not go down. The second thing I noticed was that when I asked her a question, there was a small pause before she answered. The same length of pause every time, almost exactly a second, as if she were waiting for something. The third thing I noticed was that when she did speak, the words were correct, but the order was, sometimes, very slightly wrong. She said at one point, "Warm in here, it is good," not how a tired person speaks, how someone speaks who has heard tired people speak. I asked her, in as casual a voice as I could manage, where exactly on the Kintla Trail she had become separated from her husband. "At the lake," she said. "Which end of the lake?" There was the pause. Then, "The far end, where the trees are." "The trees are at both ends. The trees are along the entire shoreline. Trees describe the entirety of every lake in this park." I stood up. I told her, very gently, that I was going to step outside to the radio in the truck for a minute to call in her information. She watched me from the chair by the stove. Her head did not turn as I crossed the room. Only her eyes followed me. I went out to the truck. I locked myself inside it. I called Aaron on the long range. I told him in a low voice, in a few short sentences, what was sitting in my cabin. He was silent for about 3 seconds, and then he said, "Do not go back in there. Get out. Drive to the gate. I am coming." I said, "Aaron, she is sitting by my stove, in my blanket." He said, "Tyler, listen to me. There is no woman." I looked at the cabin. The window was lit yellow by the lantern. I could see her shape through the curtain. She was sitting exactly where I had left her, in the same posture, the mug still raised to her lips at exactly the same angle. I drove out. I left her in there. I drove the 3 miles to the gate, and Aaron met me there in his green truck about an hour later, and we drove back together with our headlights on bright and the shotguns racked. The cabin was empty. The blanket was on the chair, neatly folded. The mug was on the table, full to the brim with cold coffee. The lantern was still burning. There were no boot prints on the porch, only a small dark spot where the rainwater had pooled. 3 nights after that, the call came in for a missing girl. Her name was Wren. She was 7 years old. Her family had been camped at Bowman, and she had wandered off in the late afternoon while her mother was setting up the tent. I went out with 2 volunteers and Aaron. We grid searched the shoreline. About 40 minutes in, I heard a child's voice in the brush off to my right calling, "Mommy, mommy, mommy, mommy," 4 times in exactly the same tone, with the same length of pause between each call. Then again, then again. I did not move toward it. I waved Aaron over. He listened with me. His face went the color of wet ash. We backed away from that brush. We searched the other direction. About 20 minutes later, I found Wren. She was wedged into the hollow of a downed cedar, about 80 yards off the trail, with her arms wrapped around her knees and her face pressed into her sleeve. She was not crying. She was being completely silent, the way a fawn is silent when it has been told to stay. When I knelt down and said her name, she looked up at me and she said in a small, clear whisper, "Are you a real one?" I told her I was a park ranger and my name was Tyler and her mommy was waiting for her. She studied my face for a long second and then she crawled out and put her arms around my neck and held on. She did not speak again until we got her back to the campground. The first thing she said when she saw her mother was, "There is another mommy in the woods. Do not listen to her." Her mother started to cry. I did not. I had stopped being able to cry about anything that happened in those woods. We went out for Annika one more time, in the second week of June, after the snow had finished melting from the high passes and the bears had come down off their dens hungry and slow. By we, I mean Aaron, myself, and a younger ranger named Nathan Hale, who had transferred in from Yellowstone for the summer season. Nathan was 26. He had a degree in wildlife biology from Bozeman. He was strong and fit and well-trained, and he did not believe a single word of the things Aaron and I tried to tell him about the North Fork country. He was polite about it. He was the kind of polite that meant we were being humored. We went up the Bowman Trail at first light, past the lower campsite where the Ostmans had eaten their last breakfast, past the burn where Annika's pack had been found, and we kept going. We climbed for 4 hours. We crossed Aaron's upper pour-off, in daylight, with our radios on and our bear spray loose in its holsters. We dropped down into a small drainage that does not appear on any of the public issue maps, only on the older topo sheets the rangers keep for ourselves. In that drainage, on a small flat shelf of rock above a creek, we found the clearing. I do not want to describe it more than I have to. There was a circle of bare ground about 30 feet across, in the middle of dense forest, with no fallen trees and no underbrush, and no sign that fire or wind had cleared it. The ground at the edges was packed hard, the way a deer trail is packed hard, except that the packing went in a perfect circle and did not lead anywhere. Inside the circle, arranged carefully, almost lovingly, were objects. Boots, pairs of boots, set side by side. There were maybe 40 pairs. Some of them were modern. One pair I recognized as the same brand and size Annika Ostman had been wearing. Some of them were older. There was a pair of leather work boots with hobnails that I would later be told dated to the 1920s. There was a pair of moccasins, almost rotted away, that Aaron would not even look at directly. There were jackets, folded. There were eyeglasses, in pairs and singly, set down in small careful stacks. There was a wedding ring on a flat stone in the very center of the clearing, with a smaller ring beside it. There was a child's red wool mitten. The mitten was new. Nathan said, "What in the hell?" Aaron said very quietly, "We do not touch any of it. We mark the GPS. We back out the way we came. We do not speak again until we are off this shelf." We did the first 2 of those things. We did not get to do the third. I do not know what time the storm came in, only that it came in fast, the way they do up there, and that within 10 minutes of leaving the clearing the trees overhead were thrashing and the rain was sideways and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. We tried to keep visual contact. We tied a length of cord between us. The cord broke on a deadfall, and when I turned around I could see Aaron about 10 feet behind me, but Nathan was gone. I shouted for him. Aaron grabbed my pack strap and shook his head no hard, the rain running off his hat brim into his collar. We hunkered under a spruce and waited. The storm passed in about 20 minutes, the way the bad ones often do. When the wind dropped, we heard Nathan's voice. It came from the slope above us, maybe 100 yards up. It said, "Aaron, Tyler, my leg is stuck. I cannot move it. I think it is broken. I need help." Aaron's hand on my pack strap tightened until his knuckles were white. A minute later, the same voice said, from a slightly different angle, the same words, the same pitch, the same small catch on the word broken. A minute after that, from somewhere below us now, the same voice said the same thing again. It said it 8 more times over the next half hour, from 8 different positions, working its way around our hiding place in a slow loop. Then a different voice came. It was my voice. It was saying, "Aaron, I found him. He is hurt. Come down here." It came from below us. Then it said the same thing from above us. Then it said the same thing from where Aaron was sitting, 2 feet away from me, while Aaron's actual mouth was clamped shut behind his hand. I am being literal. The voice that I have heard come out of my own throat my entire adult life was speaking from a position approximately 24 inches from my left ear, and there was no body in that position, and nothing I have ever read or heard or been told prepared me for what that does to a man. We did not move for 2 more hours. We sat under that spruce. We did not key our radios. We did not whisper to each other. We did not shift our weight. After a long time, the voices stopped. After a longer time, the light began to fade. Aaron finally took his hand off my pack strap and very slowly, very carefully, leaned forward and looked at me, and his eyes asked me a question, and I shook my head. We came down off the ridge in the dark. We came down by feel, by the sound of the creek to our right, by the slope of the ground under our boots. We did not use our headlamps. We did not call for Nathan. We found him at first light the next morning when the search team came up. He was about a quarter mile off the trail, sitting upright with his back against a tree in a small natural alcove of mossy stone. He looked, at first glance, like a man taking a nap. He had no visible wounds. The coroner said exposure, although the night had not been cold enough to kill a healthy man in good gear, and Nathan had been a healthy man in good gear. He had answered. Sometime in those 2 hours under the spruce, he had answered something that called itself one of us. That is the only explanation I have. I have stopped trying to find a better one. My mother died on the 12th of August, at 3 in the morning, in the hospice in Kalispell, with her hand in my sister Ayana's hand and a thin rain falling outside the window. I drove down for the service. I wore my dress uniform. I scattered her ashes, per her wishes, off the dock at the south end of the lake near my cabin, on a clear evening when the surface was the color of beaten copper and the loons were calling out on the water. My sister stood beside me. She is a teacher in Missoula. She does not believe what I do, and I have not asked her to. I gave her our father's old service knife, and she gave me our mother's wedding band, and we held each other on that dock for a long time without speaking. After she drove away, I sat on the dock until full dark. I watched the lake. I waited. About an hour after the last light, a voice came from the far shore. It was my mother's voice. It said, "Tyler, honey, I am so cold. Can you come get me? Just come get me, sweetheart." I closed my eyes. I sat very still on the dock with my mother's wedding band closed in my fist. I felt the warmth of the small gold circle pressed into my palm, and I thought about my mother's actual voice, which I had been listening to for 41 years, and I knew, with a cold and final certainty, that the voice on the far shore was not it. It was close. It was very close. It had her words. It had her cadence. It even had the small wet sound she made in her throat when she had been crying. But it did not have her. It had a recording of her, made out of whatever it is that lives in those woods and listens. I did not answer. I sat there for a long time, and I let it call, and I did not answer. After a while it stopped. I went back up the path to the cabin. I went inside. I locked the door, although locking the door is mostly a gesture. I lit the lantern. I made tea. I sat at the table with my mother's ring in front of me on the table, And I thought about every reason a man might have to walk away from a place like this, and every reason a man might have to stay. I am still there. I am writing this in the cabin where my predecessor wrote his reports, and where his predecessor wrote hers, going back to the man who built it in 1933. The cast iron stove is going. The lantern is on. The lake is dark outside the window. The radio is turned low. My shotgun is across my knees. It is just past midnight. I stay because someone has to. That is the simplest answer, and it is the truest one. I stay because Erin Calder is going to retire next spring, and the new ranger will be a young woman from Missoula who already loves these mountains and who has no idea what lives in them, and somebody has to be on the porch with her on her first night and tell her the 3 rules. The same way Erin Calder was on the porch with me. I stay because Wren and her mother got back into their car and drove home to Iowa, and a child knew enough at 7 years old to hide in a downed cedar and stay quiet, and that is a kind of teaching we should not lose. I stay because the things in those woods cannot leave them. They are bound to that country the way a parasite is bound to its host. They cannot follow you out to the highway. They cannot get into your truck. They cannot reach your mother in her hospice bed in Kalispell. They are stuck up there hungry and patient and learning, and the only thing that keeps them from getting fat is people who know not to answer. I stay because my father stayed. I have come to believe, over the past 2 years, that my father knew about all of this. He never said a word about it to me when I was a boy. He made me memorize the 3 rules, and he passed them off as bare safety, and I did not learn until I was sitting in the same chair he had sat in that bare safety has nothing to do with rule number 3. My father stayed for 31 years. He came home alive every night. When he died of an ordinary heart attack in his own bed, at the age of 68, with my mother beside him. The woods did not get him. He never answered, not once, not in 3 decades. That is the inheritance my father left me. Not the cabin, not the uniform, the discipline of the closed mouth. I want to tell you, if you are reading this and you ever come up to the North Fork country, if you ever hike past Polbridge in the long blue evening of a Montana summer, and you smell the cedar and the cold water and you think, my God, this is the most beautiful place I have ever been, and you are right, it is. I want to tell you this, most of you will be fine. Most of you will hike your loop and come back and post your photos and remember it as the trip of your life. The thing in those woods is not greedy. It does not need much. It works slowly. It picks 1 or 2 of us a year, sometimes none, and most of those it picks were already going to be lost in some way I cannot explain. But if you are out there at dusk, on the trail or in your tent or sitting by a lakeshore, and you hear someone say your name, and the voice is familiar, and the voice is patient, and the voice is just a little too even, do not answer it. Do not call back. Do not say hello. Who is there? Do not say anything at all. Walk, if you can walk, toward other people, toward firelight, toward the road. Walk and do not look behind you, because looking is a kind of answering, and answering is a kind of permission. If a ranger comes up the trail and asks you if you are all right, look at his face for a long second before you reply. Look at his eyes. A real ranger will not be offended. A real ranger will nod, slow, and he will know exactly why you looked. And he will say something only a real man would say, and you will know. I am sitting in my cabin. The stove is going. The lantern is on. There is a voice down at the lake right now, calling my name in my mother's voice, and I am not going to answer it. And in the morning I am going to make coffee, and put on my uniform, and walk the meadow, and check the trailhead register and do my job. That is what we do up here. That is all we have ever been able to do. My name is Tyler Whitehorse. I am a park ranger in the North Fork district of Glacier National Park. I am alive. I plan to stay that way. Do not answer.